The Spaceport in Ark Raiders is one of the most lore-dense locations in the entire game, and in this video we are breaking down everything about it, from the Exodus program that launched humanity toward the stars, to what Ark is doing inside those derelict halls right now. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. So this video took me a long time to put together. I went through every environmental detail, item description, audio fragment, and piece of ambient lore I could find tied to the spaceport. And I wanted to build the most complete picture of this location that exists anywhere. The choice I made when assembling this was to start not with the present state of the map as you drop into it, but with the deep history of what this place actually was before the collapse. A lot of lore videos jump straight into what Ark is doing there now, but the real weight of the spaceport comes from understanding what was lost. That is where we begin. Chapter 1. Before the Stars, the world that built the spaceport. To understand the spaceport, you have to understand the world that built it. The world of Ark Raiders is not a post-apocalyptic setting in the traditional sense, where things simply fell apart due to war or disease. This was a world that saw the end coming, a world that had enough warning to actually try to do something about it. The evidence scattered across the game suggests that at some point in the not-too-distant future, humanity became aware that something was coming from beyond the atmosphere, something mechanical, something vast, and something that had no interest in negotiating. Whether that awareness came from scientific observation, intercepted signals, or some early incursion that the public was never told about, is not entirely clear from the fragments we have, but the conclusion was the same. The world needed a plan. Before the Exodus shuttles ever left the ground, before the launch pads were even poured, there was a period of intense international reckoning. Governments that had spent decades in competition and conflict suddenly found themselves facing a threat that did not distinguish between borders. The lore points toward a kind of desperate, messy cooperation that happened in the final years before the worst of the Ark incursions began. This was not a clean, cinematic alliance. It was fractured, slow, and full of competing interests. Different factions wanted different things from any survival program. Some wanted to save as many people as possible. Some wanted to save the right people. Some wanted to save as much knowledge as possible. And all of those competing agendas left marks on what the Exodus program eventually became. Marks you can still read in the spaceport's layout and the decisions that were clearly baked into its design. The planet itself was already struggling before Ark ever made its full presence known. Environmental damage, resource depletion, and social fracture had been grinding away at human civilization for generations. What the Ark incursions did was accelerate a process that was already underway. One possible reading of the early lore suggests that the first encounters with Ark units were initially mistaken for some kind of extreme weather phenomenon or satellite debris events. Small communities reported strange mechanical objects falling from the sky, moving with purpose, destroying infrastructure with what seemed like indifference rather than hostility. Nobody had the language for what was happening yet. The frameworks for understanding it simply did not exist. By the time the true nature of the threat was understood, a significant amount of Earth's outer infrastructure had already been compromised, and the window for a comprehensive response was closing fast. It is worth sitting with the geography of this for a moment, because geography matters when you're trying to understand why the spaceport exists where it does. Launch facilities are not built just anywhere. They require flat land, proximity to the equator when possible for orbital efficiency, significant infrastructure for fuel and logistics, and enough distance from population centres to be manageable when things go wrong. The spaceport in Ark Raiders appears to occupy a site that was deliberately chosen for all of these reasons. The surrounding landscape suggests a region that was already somewhat isolated, already accustomed to industrial-scale operations, and positioned in a way that gave it strategic value both as a launch site and as a defensive position. The people who chose this site were not thinking primarily about aesthetics. They were thinking about function, about survival, and about the cold mathematics of getting vessels off the ground. The world government structures that ultimately funded and oversaw the Exodus program were not the same governments that existed at the beginning of this era. The law suggests a period of consolidation where smaller national entities were absorbed into larger administrative blocks, partly out of economic necessity and partly because coordinating a planetary-scale survival project required a level of centralized decision-making that older governmental models simply could not provide. This consolidation was not peaceful. There are fragments scattered through the game that hint at conflicts, suppressions, and forced agreements that happened in the shadows of the official Exodus narrative. People who resisted the consolidation were not always simply overruled. The scale of what was being attempted justified, in the minds of the planners, a degree of ruthlessness that would have been unacceptable in more ordinary times. And the spaceport is, in some ways, the physical monument to that ruthlessness, a monument to what was built and what was sacrificed to build it. Scientific communities played a central role in what came before the spaceport. The decision to build a launch facility at all was the result of years of analysis, modelling, and debate among some of the most brilliant minds the world had left. There was a genuine school of thought that argued evacuation was the wrong answer, that humanity should dig in, fortify, and fight. There was another school that argued the arc units could be studied, understood, and perhaps even communicated with. The evacuation faction ultimately won the argument, not because the other positions were unreasonable, but because the timeline projections were simply too grim. When the models were run honestly, when the data was not filtered through optimism, the conclusion that emerged was that Earth as a habitable environment had a limited window remaining, and that window was measured in years, not decades. Building the spaceport was the operationalization of that conclusion. There is something quietly tragic about the scientific consensus that drove the Exodus program, a tragedy that the spaceport still carries in its bones. The scientists who concluded that evacuation was necessary were not giving up on Earth. Most of them loved the planet. Most of them had families rooted in specific places, specific communities, specific landscapes. The conclusion they reached was not born of indifference. It was born of rigor. You can imagine the meetings, the papers, the late nights running the same models again, hoping for different results. The law fragments that touch on this period suggest a community of people who were methodical right up until the moment they accepted the worst, and then channeled everything they had into making the escape work. The spaceport is partly their monument. The cracked concrete and the rusted gantries that you walk through as a raider now were once the product of an almost inconceivable act of scientific will. Engineering the world's response to ARC required not just scientists, but logisticians, builders, and an enormous labour force. The construction of the spaceport was one of the largest civil engineering projects in human history at that point, comparable only to the greatest infrastructure projects of previous centuries, but compressed into a fraction of the time those earlier projects had taken. Resources were diverted from other uses at a scale that disrupted daily life across entire regions. Materials that would have gone to housing, roads, hospitals, and schools instead went to the spaceport's foundations and gantry structures. The people who built this facility were not all volunteers. Many of them were workers who had been assigned to the project, whose options had been narrowed by the emergency conditions of the time. Their labour is embedded in every beam and weld of the spaceport, though their names are nowhere recorded in any official capacity that the law has so far revealed. The early years of spaceport construction were defined by two things: speed and secrecy. The planning committees that oversaw the Exodus program had determined early on that public knowledge of the full scope of the project would create more problems than it solved. Partial information was released. Official statements described a new generation of orbital infrastructure, scientific platforms, resource satellites. The words evacuation and collapse were not used in public-facing communications for a long time. This was not purely cynical. The reasoning, as the law suggests it, was that panic would slow construction, destabilize the economies needed to fund the project, and potentially trigger conflicts that would make even the partial success of the evacuation impossible. So the spaceport was built in a kind of official silence, its true purpose known to relatively few, its visible progress attributed to other ambitions entirely. What did the workers who built the spaceport believe they were building? This is one of the more quietly fascinating questions that the law raises without fully answering. Some of them clearly knew. The technical teams, the systems engineers, the launch coordinators, they understood exactly what they were constructing and why. But the broader labour force, the people pouring concrete, welding frames, digging foundations, they were told different things at different times. The law suggests a kind of layered disclosure, where the deeper you were embedded in the project, the more truth you were permitted to know. For the outermost layers of the workforce, the spaceport was an advanced aerospace facility, ambitious but not unprecedented. For the innermost layers, it was the physical infrastructure of humanity's last gamble. That gap in understanding created a strange culture on the construction site, a place where people worked side by side with fundamentally different ideas about what they were doing and why. The cultural life around the spaceport during its construction period is hinted at in some of the ambient details scattered through the map. There were communities that grew up around the facility, temporary housing that became semi-permanent over time, canteens and social spaces that sprang up to serve a workforce that had no other place to go. These communities had their own dynamics, their own hierarchies, their own social tensions. In one possible reading, the spaceport was not just a launch facility. It was also, for a time, a kind of city. A city without deep roots. A city whose population knew, on some level, that it was not meant to last, but a city nonetheless. The traces of that community are embedded in the environmental details of the map, if you know to look for them, the worn pathways between buildings, the spaces that were clearly more than just functional, the remnants of a lived experience that predates the collapse. The political economy of the Exodus program was deeply unequal, and the spaceport was at the centre of that inequality. The shuttles could not take everyone. That was understood from the beginning. The number of people who could realistically be evacuated, given the limitations of the technology and the launch window, was a small fraction of the global population. This meant that decisions had to be made about who would go. Those decisions were made by committees, by administrators, by people with power and access, and the evidence suggests that those decisions were not made fairly. The wealthy, the technically skilled, the politically connected, these groups were systematically overrepresented in the early passenger selections. The spaceport was built by everyone, but it was not built for everyone. That contradiction is one of the deepest wounds embedded in this location's history. Resistance to the Exodus program existed almost from the beginning. Not everyone accepted the premise that evacuation was the right response, and not everyone accepted the premise that the selection process for who got to leave was legitimate. The law hints at organised opposition groups, people who argued that the resources being poured into the spaceport should instead be used to fortify and defend Earth, to build shelters, to develop weapons systems capable of fighting Ark. Others argued that even if evacuation was the right choice, the selection process needed to be democratized, made transparent, open to fair lottery rather than controlled by existing power structures. These movements left traces on the spaceport's history: security protocols, containment barriers, elements of the facility's layout that seem defensive against human intrusion rather than just against external threats. All of these point toward a facility that was always, at least partly, managing the threat from below as well as the threat from above. The technology that made the Exodus shuttles possible did not emerge from nothing. It was the product of decades of aerospace development, accelerated by the emergency conditions of the pre-collapse period into a compressed timeline that would not have been achievable in ordinary circumstances. What the spaceport represents, architecturally and technologically, is the endpoint of an entire tradition of human spaceflight. A tradition that began with the first tentative rockets and culminated here in these enormous gantries and fueling systems, in these control towers and processing facilities. The game treats this technology as genuinely impressive, something worth guarding, something worth remembering. And the lore frames it as bittersweet, because the technology was magnificent and it worked, at least partially, but it could not save everyone, and the world that produced it did not survive its own brilliance. There is a particular architectural language to the spaceport that speaks to its pre-collapse origins. The buildings are large, functional, built to accommodate the scale of what they needed to do, but there are also elements of intentional design in certain areas, spaces that suggest the people who built this facility wanted it to mean something beyond its function. There are ceremonial elements embedded in the spaceport's architecture, spaces that feel like they were designed to be walked through slowly, to be experienced rather than merely traversed. This makes sense when you consider that the spaceport was always going to be a departure point, and departure points carry emotional weight. The architects understood that the people passing through this facility might be leaving Earth forever. They built spaces that tried to honor that weight, even while they kept the machinery of departure running at maximum efficiency. Fuel infrastructure is one of the less glamorous but absolutely essential elements of any launch facility, and the spaceport's fuel systems are enormous. The scale of what was needed to lift the Exodus shuttles off the ground required fuel reserves and handling systems that represent some of the most impressive industrial engineering in the game's environment. Walking through the fuel processing areas of the spaceport map, you get a sense of the sheer physical scale of the launch operation. These are not small systems. These are the systems of an institution that was doing something on a civilizational scale. The lore suggests that the fuel infrastructure was one of the most difficult and contested elements of the construction process, both because of the technical challenges involved and because the sourcing of fuel materials at this scale required agreements and logistics chains that stretched across the globe. Communication systems at the spaceport were critical for more than just the launches. The facility needed to coordinate with orbital stations, with incoming supply chains, with government authorities, and eventually with the shuttles after they had left the atmosphere. The communication towers and relay systems, visible in the spaceport's architecture, tell a story of a facility that was always plugged into a global network, always transmitting and receiving, always part of something larger than itself. After the collapse, most of those communication channels went dark. The towers are still standing, or at least the remains of some of them are, but the network they once connected to no longer exists in any meaningful sense. One possible reading of certain environmental details suggests that ARC may have repurposed some of this communication infrastructure for its own purposes, though the nature of those purposes remains unclear from what the lore currently reveals. The human element of the spaceport's pre-collapse history is something I kept coming back to while assembling this video. The facility's records, such as they exist in the game's fragments, are full of the traces of specific people, not just administrators and engineers, but maintenance workers, security personnel, cooks, cleaners, medical staff. The spaceport was a community before it was a ruin, and that community was composed of thousands of individual human lives, each of which had its own story, its own stakes in what was happening, its own relationship to the larger catastrophe unfolding around them. The lore does not give us most of those stories in detail, but it leaves enough fragments that you can sense the human texture of the place. And that texture matters because it is what transforms the spaceport from a backdrop into a character. Medical facilities at the spaceport were more significant than you might initially expect for a launch facility. The stress of operating in the pre-collapse environment, the physical demands of the construction and maintenance work, and eventually the conditions faced by people waiting for evacuation selection, all created substantial medical needs. The lore fragments that touch on the medical aspects of the spaceport suggest a facility that was constantly managing health crises, physical injuries, and the psychological toll of the situation. Mental health resources were apparently a significant concern in the later phases of the facility's operational period, as the reality of what was happening became harder to deny, and the pressure on workers and selected evacuees alike became intense. These details matter because they remind you that the spaceport was never just a machine. It was a place where human beings lived under extraordinary stress trying to do their jobs while the world ended around them. Security was always a major feature of the spaceport, even before ARC made it a necessity. The combination of sensitive technology, scarce evacuation resources, and rising public awareness of what the facility truly represented meant that physical security was built into the design from the beginning. Access control systems, reinforced perimeters, armed personnel, surveillance infrastructure, all of these were features of the spaceport long before the collapse. The security culture of the facility was one of the things that shaped its internal social dynamics. People were accustomed to being watched, to having their movements monitored, to operating under protocols that assumed bad actors were always a possibility. When you walk through the spaceport as a raider today and encounter the layers of containment and control that ARC has layered over the existing infrastructure, you are in some ways just seeing the continuation of a security culture that was already deeply embedded in this place. Power generation for a facility of this scale is no small problem. The spaceport required enormous amounts of energy to operate its launch systems, its processing facilities, its communication arrays, and its everyday infrastructure. The power systems visible in certain areas of the map suggest multiple redundant generation sources, a reflection of the facility's critical role and the understanding that power failure at the wrong moment could compromise an entire launch cycle. The lore touches on the engineering challenges of keeping so much energy flowing reliably, and the solutions that were developed, while not always explained in technical detail, are visible in the physical evidence of the map. Transformer banks, generator halls, distribution infrastructure, all of it speaks to an institution that understood its own vulnerability to power disruption and did everything it could to mitigate that risk. Water and waste systems at the spaceport tell a story of long-term habitation. These are not the systems you build for a temporary facility. They are the systems you build for a place where thousands of people are going to live and work for years. The scale and sophistication of the spaceport's basic infrastructure confirms that this was always intended to be an operational site for an extended period, not just long enough to conduct a handful of launches and shut down. The Exodus program was apparently planned across multiple phases, with potentially dozens of shuttle launches spread over a period of years, which meant the spaceport needed to be a sustainable community in its own right, capable of supporting its population through all of those phases. The infrastructure for that sustained habitation is still there in the spaceport's bones, even if the life that once animated it is long gone. Training facilities within the spaceport complex are suggested by certain spatial configurations in the map. People did not simply show up and board a shuttle. There were preparation processes, both physical and psychological, that passengers had to go through before a launch. For some of this preparation, dedicated spaces were needed, spaces where people could be briefed, medically evaluated, physically conditioned, and mentally prepared for what they were about to experience. The law hints at a selection and preparation process that was intensive by any standard, not just because of the physical demands of spaceflight, but because of the psychological demands of permanently leaving your home planet. The training facilities that supported this process were probably some of the more emotionally charged spaces in the entire spaceport complex, and some of that charge seems to linger in the environmental details that remain. The cultural artifacts that remain in the spaceport give a picture of a community that was trying to maintain some sense of normalcy under impossible circumstances. There are traces of recreational spaces, of communal gathering areas, of the kinds of decorations and modifications that people make to institutional spaces to humanize them. People put up pictures, rearranged furniture, created little enclaves of personal expression within the official architecture of the facility. These small acts of humanization are among the most moving things in the spaceport's environmental storytelling. They are the evidence that, even in the middle of a civilizational catastrophe, even in a place defined by the most extreme kind of departure, people still tried to make a home, still tried to find moments of comfort and connection, still tried to be human in the fullest sense of that word. The relationship between the spaceport and the surrounding civilian population was complex and often tense. For communities living near the facility, the spaceport represented both hope and exclusion. Hope because it was proof that someone was doing something, that not everyone in power had simply abandoned the situation. Exclusion because access to the facility was tightly controlled, and the majority of people in those surrounding communities had no realistic prospect of being selected for evacuation. The law suggests that the management of this tension was one of the ongoing administrative challenges of the spaceport's operational period. Information control, community liaison programs, and at times more forceful methods of managing public access and expectations, all of these were tools that the spaceport's administrators used to maintain the social stability that the facility's operation required. Scientific research at the spaceport was not limited to the engineering problems of the launches. The facility also hosted significant research programs related to Ark itself, efforts to understand the nature of the entities that were forcing the evacuation in the first place. The law is suggestive here, rather than explicit, but there are environmental details in certain areas of the spaceport that point toward research functions that go beyond what you would expect from a pure launch facility. Containment areas, specialized equipment housings, laboratory-scale spaces in unexpected locations, all of these hint at a facility that was simultaneously running away from Ark and trying to understand it. Whether any of that research produced useful insights before the collapse is one of the open questions the law invites you to sit with. The logistics chain that fed the spaceport was global in scope. Raw materials, manufactured components, specialized systems, personnel, all of it had to be sourced from across the world and delivered to this facility. The law hints at the complexity of this supply chain and the degree to which its disruption was one of the factors that ultimately constrained the scale of the Exodus effort. As Ark incursions became more frequent and more damaging, keeping the supply chains intact became progressively harder. Routes that had been reliable became dangerous. Suppliers that had been consistent became unavailable. The spaceport, for all its internal capability, was never self-sufficient. It depended on a global network, and as that network frayed under Ark pressure, the facility's ability to maintain its launch schedule was increasingly compromised. Children were present at the spaceport, and this is one of the details that makes the facility's history feel most human. Workers had families. Selected evacuees brought their children. The practical reality of running a large facility for an extended period meant that the presence of children was unavoidable, and the spaceport developed accommodations for it. There were spaces for children within the facility, educational provisions, medical care scaled for pediatric needs. The law does not dwell on this, but the evidence of it is there for those who look carefully at the environmental details. Children growing up in the shadow of launch gantries with the roar of test firings as a regular feature of their world, with the knowledge that their lives were tied to the success of the biggest engineering project in human history. The psychological experience of childhood in the spaceport is something the game touches on only briefly, but it is one of the most resonant threads in the facility's human history. The administrative culture of the spaceport was shaped by the unique pressures of its mission. This was an institution that had to operate efficiently under conditions of extreme stress, with stakes that were essentially infinite and timelines that were always tighter than comfortable. The management structures that evolved in response to these conditions were not always kind. Efficiency was prized above almost everything else. Decisions that would have required extensive consultation and deliberation in a normal institutional setting were made quickly and unilaterally because there was no time for anything else. The law hints at a management culture that was functional in the narrow sense of getting the launches done, but damaging in other ways to the well-being of the people working within it and to the quality of some of the decisions made under its constraints. The environmental hazards of the spaceport's location were a constant management challenge. A launch facility of this scale generates significant local environmental impacts, from fuel contamination to noise to the physical infrastructure of the launches themselves. The surrounding landscape was shaped by years of this activity, and the law suggests that environmental concerns were explicitly deprioritized in the interest of maintaining operational tempo. This was a rational choice given the stakes, but it was a choice with consequences. The area around the spaceport had already been significantly altered by the facility's operation before ARC added its own alterations on top. The landscape you traverse as a raider is layered with these different phases of damage and change, each one telling part of the story of what this place was and what it endured. Emergency protocols at the spaceport were extensive and frequently rehearsed. The possibility of catastrophic failure, whether from technical malfunction, ARC attack, or social disruption, was always present, and the facility's planners built response systems proportionate to these risks. Evacuation routes, emergency shelters, lockdown procedures, contingency launch protocols, all of these were features of the spaceport's operational planning. Some of these systems are still physically present in the map, readable in the architecture of certain corridors and access points. The emergency infrastructure of the spaceport tells a story of an institution that was perpetually aware of its own fragility, that never allowed itself to become complacent, because complacency at a facility like this was not just a failure of management, but potentially a catastrophe for the entire human project. The relationship between military and civilian authority at the spaceport was a site of ongoing tension. The facility was ultimately a civilian project, driven by a scientific and governmental mandate to ensure human survival. But the security needs of the facility and the increasingly militarized environment of the pre-collapse world meant that military presence and influence grew steadily over the operational period. The law suggests a facility that moved from primarily civilian control toward a more hybrid model as conditions deteriorated, with military protocols gradually displacing civilian ones in more and more areas of operation. The physical evidence of this shift is visible in the spaceport's architecture, in the increasingly fortified character of certain spaces, in the security infrastructure that expanded as the facility aged. The tension between military efficiency and civilian values left marks that you can still read in the ruins. Records keeping at the spaceport was both obsessive and selective. The facility generated enormous amounts of documentation, procedural records, technical logs, personnel files, mission reports. But what was preserved and what was allowed to disappear was not random. Certain records, particularly those related to the selection process for evacuation and the decision-making around who was included and excluded, appear to have been managed very carefully. The law suggests that there was institutional awareness that the selection process would be judged harshly by history, and that awareness manifested in a pattern of documentation that was simultaneously comprehensive about operational details and remarkably sparse about the ethical dimensions of the choices being made. The gaps in the record are as telling as the records themselves. The aesthetics of hope and despair are both present in the spaceport's architectural language, and they coexist in a way that feels true to the contradictions of the place. There are areas of the facility that were clearly designed to inspire, to make people feel the grandeur of what they were part of, the magnificence of the human project of reaching the stars. And there are other areas that were designed with pure utilitarian grimness, spaces where the only priority was function, and where no concession was made to human feeling. Walking between these two kinds of space gives the spaceport a powerful emotional register that is central to the map's character as a law environment. The game's environmental designers understood this duality and built it into the layout deliberately, giving players the experience of a place that was once full of both soaring ambition and grinding desperation. The timeline of the spaceport's operational period is not entirely clear from the available lore, but certain markers allow for a rough reconstruction. The facility appears to have been in active launch operations for a period spanning several years, during which it conducted multiple shuttle launches, each carrying a portion of the selected evacuee population. The spacing between launches was determined by a combination of technical readiness, fuel availability, and the strategic decisions of the program's administrators. Not all launches were successful. The lore hints at failed launches, technical disasters, missions that did not achieve the intended outcome. These failures were managed internally, kept out of public awareness as much as possible, because the psychological impact on the remaining population and on the workforce of the spaceport itself would have been devastating if widely known. The role of corporate entities in the spaceport's history is one of the more interesting and underexplored threads in the lore. The scale of the project required not just governmental authority, but private industrial capability, and the corporations that contributed to the Exodus program were not doing so purely out of altruism. They were negotiating, extracting concessions, securing positions for their leadership and key personnel in the evacuation lists, ensuring that the technical knowledge embedded in their organizations would survive the collapse in one form or another. The corporate dimension of the Exodus program gives it a texture that is recognizable and uncomfortable. The feeling that even in the face of civilizational extinction, the mechanisms of self-interest were still operating, still shaping outcomes, still determining who lived and who was left behind. Navigation and orbital infrastructure were essential complements to the spaceport's launch capability. A shuttle leaving Earth needs somewhere to go, and the development of that destination, whether orbital stations, deep space platforms, or longer-range targets, was a parallel project running alongside the construction of the spaceport itself. The lore fragments that touch on the destination side of the Exodus program are sparse but suggestive. There is a sense of something out there, something built with equal urgency and equal sacrifice, waiting to receive the people that the shuttles carried. The relationship between what was built on the ground and what was built in orbit or beyond is one of the more mysterious aspects of the Exodus story, and one that the spaceport's environmental details invite you to speculate about without fully resolving. The psychological culture of the spaceport was shaped by the concept of the threshold, the understanding that this was a place where people crossed from one world to another, from a dying Earth to whatever came next. Threshold spaces have always carried particular psychological weight in human experience, and the spaceport's designers were aware of this in ways that are visible in the architecture. There are spaces in the facility that function as transition zones, that seem designed to help people move, psychologically, from the world they were leaving to the world they were entering. These spaces are among the most architecturally considered in the entire facility, full of deliberate choices about lighting, scale, and spatial sequence. They speak to a design sensibility that understood the human experience of departure and tried to support it, even in the middle of a catastrophe. The scientific instruments present in the spaceport's control and monitoring systems were the most advanced available at the time of construction. The facility's ability to manage a launch successfully depended on real-time data about atmospheric conditions, orbital parameters, arc activity, and the technical status of the shuttles themselves. This data infrastructure was enormous, spanning sensors, communication relays, and processing systems that were state-of-the-art. After the collapse, much of this data infrastructure was either destroyed or rendered non-functional by the loss of the broader networks it depended on. But some of it appears to have survived in some form, and the law suggests that ARC, in its occupation of the spaceport, has found uses for some of this sensing and monitoring capability. What ARC is monitoring and what it is doing with the data it collects is one of the open questions that the spaceport poses. The archives of the spaceport, assuming they survive in any form within the facility, would be among the most historically significant collections of human knowledge remaining on Earth. Mission records, technical documentation, personnel files, scientific data, the administrative records of the Exodus program, all of this was generated and stored at the spaceport over its operational period. Whether any of it is recoverable and what it would reveal if it were is one of the implicit mysteries that the law sets up around the facility. Raiders who venture into the spaceport's depths are, in a sense, potential archaeologists, people who might uncover fragments of this archive in the course of their operations. The possibility that critical historical knowledge is buried in the spaceport's ruins is part of what makes the location feel important beyond its tactical and resource value. The relationship between the spaceport and Earth's broader ecosystem during its operational period is a dark thread in the facility's history. A launch facility of this scale has massive environmental impacts in normal times. Operated under emergency conditions, with environmental concerns explicitly deprioritized, those impacts were compounded. The area around the spaceport became significantly altered during its operational period, a sacrifice zone in the original sense of the term, a place deliberately offered up for a greater purpose. The people who lived in that zone, whose communities were disrupted or displaced by the facility's expansion and operation, are among the invisible population of the spaceport's history, people whose experience of the Exodus program was not departure, but dispossession. Food systems at the spaceport were a significant logistical challenge. Feeding thousands of people in an increasingly disrupted supply environment required creative solutions, dedicated agricultural infrastructure, and the kind of operational flexibility that comes from planning for contingencies. The law hints at the progressive isolation of the spaceport as the world outside deteriorated, an isolation that required the facility to become more self-reliant in its food production. Greenhouses, hydroponic systems, and other controlled growing environments appear to have been developed within or adjacent to the facility. The food culture of the spaceport, the meals that people ate, the communal rituals around food, the moments of normalcy that food provides, even in extraordinary circumstances, is one of the most humanizing and least documented aspects of the facility's social history. The language of hope was one of the primary currencies of the spaceport's institutional communication. Official messaging within the facility consistently framed the Exodus program in terms of survival, of the continuation of humanity, of the preservation of human achievement. This language served important functions, maintaining morale, sustaining the commitment of the workforce, managing the psychological state of the evacuee population. But it was also, in some respects, a form of management, a way of controlling how people understood their situation and what they felt authorized to feel about it. The gap between the official language of hope and the private experience of fear, grief, and uncertainty that many people at the spaceport must have carried is one of the more poignant features of the facility's human history, a gap you can sense in the environmental details even when the lore does not name it explicitly. The role of religion and spirituality at the spaceport is suggested but not detailed in the available lore. In times of extreme crisis, people typically turn to their deepest frameworks of meaning, whether those are religious, philosophical, or community-based. A facility that was serving as humanity's literal departure point from Earth would have been a site of intense spiritual activity, regardless of any official institutional stance on the matter. The lore fragments that touch on this dimension are subtle, more environmental suggestion than direct statement, but they point toward a facility where questions of meaning, of what was being preserved and what was being lost, were always present just beneath the surface of the operational routine. The spiritual life of the spaceport is one of its most human and least recoverable histories. The children who grew up at the spaceport and eventually left on the shuttles carry a particular kind of historical weight. They are the generation that remembers Earth not as an idea or a symbol, but as a physical experience, as the smell of a particular corridor, the sound of the launch systems cycling up, the faces of specific people. If any of them survived whatever came after the Exodus, they would be the living archives of the spaceport, the people who carry its most irreplaceable kind of knowledge. The lore touches on this possibility without fully developing it, but it is present as an implication in the fragments that exist. The children of the spaceport, wherever they are part of the facility's continuing story. Night operations at the spaceport had a particular quality that is suggested by the lighting and spatial design of the facility. Launches could happen at any time, and the facility's operational schedule was not governed by the natural light cycle. But night at the spaceport must have been a different experience from day, more internally focused, quieter in some respects and stranger in others, lit by the facility's artificial systems with the darkness of the surrounding landscape pressing in from outside. The environmental details of the spaceport suggest a facility that was designed with night operations in mind, that had its own internal rhythm of light and activity that was independent of the sky above it. After the collapse, the facility still has that quality of operating on its own temporal logic, though the thing that now drives that logic is arc rather than human intention. The spaceport's relationship to the concept of Earth as home is one of the deepest philosophical threads running through its history. For everyone who passed through this facility as a departure point, the act of leaving involved a renegotiation of what home meant. Earth was not just a planet, it was accumulated history, specific landscapes, inherited culture, the physical ground of everything that human civilization had built. Leaving it was not a neutral act, it was a loss of a particular and profound kind, even when it was also a survival. The spaceport was the physical site of that loss, the place where people stood on Earth for the last time, and then stepped away from it. The weight of that fact is built into the facility's architecture, into the scale of its ceremonial spaces, into the deliberateness of its design. It is a weight that the ruins still carry. The animals that pass through the spaceport are another detail that the lore hints at without fully developing. Human beings do not easily leave behind the living things they are attached to, and the evidence suggests that the evacuation planners had to make decisions about biological preservation that went beyond just human genetics, whether this meant livestock companion animals or carefully selected samples of Earth's biodiversity The spaceport's role in the biological dimension of the Exodus is an open question that the lore raises. The infrastructure for managing living cargo would have been a significant facility in its own right, and traces of it may remain in the spaceport's current layout, if you know what to look for. The physical scale of the spaceport, when you really sit with it as a player moving through the map, is one of the most effective pieces of environmental storytelling in Ark Raiders. Buildings that dwarf you, spaces that emphasize your smallness, infrastructure that extends beyond the limits of your vision. The game uses scale deliberately, not just to create a sense of exploration, but to communicate something about the ambitions that produced this place. The spaceport was not built to be comfortable, it was built to be capable. And its scale is the measure of that capability, the physical expression of what humanity was willing to build and sacrifice when it understood the stakes. Everything that the spaceport was before the collapse, the ambition, the sacrifice, the complexity, the human texture, the engineering brilliance, the moral failures, the hope and the grief, all of it was ended by the event that the lore calls the collapse. The world that built the spaceport ceased to exist. The communities that lived around it were destroyed. The administrative structures that managed it dissolved. The human beings who worked there, most of them, did not survive. What was left was the facility itself, the concrete and steel of an institution that had been built to endure, standing in a world that no longer contained the civilization that made it. And in that silence, Ark moved in. But we will get to that. First, we need to understand the Exodus program itself, the specific plan that the spaceport was built to execute. Chapter 2, The Exodus Program, Planning Humanity's Great Escape. The Exodus program was not a single decision made on a single day. It was the product of years of analysis, argument, political maneuvering, and ultimately desperate consensus building among a fragmented global leadership class that was trying to process an unprecedented threat. The name itself, Exodus, chosen deliberately, was a statement about the nature of the undertaking. This was not a relocation program. It was not a contingency plan in the ordinary bureaucratic sense. It was an acknowledgement that the situation on Earth had reached a point where a significant portion of the human species needed to physically leave the planet in order to survive. Giving that program a name with deep historical resonance was a choice, and choices like that are made when institutions want their decisions to carry the weight of historical necessity, rather than just administrative action. The origins of the Exodus program can be traced, the lore suggests, to a classified assessment produced by a coalition of scientific bodies sometime before the public became widely aware of the Ark threat. This assessment concluded, with high confidence, that the trajectory of Ark incursion activity was incompatible with the long-term habitability of Earth's surface. The assessment was not based on a worst-case scenario. It was based on a median projection, which itself was deeply alarming. The best-case scenario in that assessment still involved a level of disruption that would have represented a civilizational catastrophe by any historical measure. It was the median and the worst-case projections that drove the decision to begin planning for departure. The people who read that assessment and had to make decisions based on it were carrying an almost unbearable weight, and the programs they created in response carry that weight too. The naming and branding of the Exodus program points toward a degree of deliberate mythologizing that the planners built into the project from the beginning. This was not called the evacuation program or the survival protocol. It was called Exodus, a word that invokes the story of a people leaving bondage for a promised land, a journey through hardship toward a better future. The choice of this name tells you something about how the program's architects wanted people to understand what they were doing. Not as a defeat, not as an abandonment, but as a beginning, a departure that was also a foundation. Whether the narrative ultimately justified the name is a question the lore leaves open, but the aspiration embedded in that naming is itself an important piece of the program's history. The planning committee for the Exodus program was assembled in stages as awareness of the need for the program spread through the relevant decision-making levels of the global governance structures of the time. The early stages of planning were necessarily small and secretive. You cannot plan a project of this scale without generating the information security risk that comes with large groups of people sharing a significant secret. The early planners were people who had been vetted at the highest levels, who had demonstrated both the necessary expertise and the capacity to keep the project compartmentalized. Their identities and the specific decisions they made in those early planning sessions are among the most opaque aspects of the Exodus program's history, buried under layers of classification and the general destruction of the collapse. Technical feasibility was the first major hurdle the planning committee had to clear. Could you actually build shuttles large enough to carry a meaningful number of people using the technology available within the time window that the threat assessment established? The answer the engineering teams came back with was essentially barely. The technology was at the edge of what was achievable. The shuttles that eventually emerged from the program were genuinely impressive feats of engineering, but they were also the product of engineering decisions made under extreme time pressure, with materials and manufacturing capabilities that were themselves increasingly stressed by the conditions of the pre-collapse period. The gap between what was technically optimal and what was practically achievable is one of the quiet tragedies of the Exodus program. The question of how many people the Exodus program could realistically evacuate was one of the most agonizing numbers the planners ever had to work with. The models produced estimates in terms of shuttle capacity, fuel availability, launch windows, and orbital infrastructure. When those estimates were finalized, they produced a number that was, by any measure of human dignity, deeply inadequate. The fraction of Earth's population that could realistically be evacuated was small enough that selecting who would go was not a logistical challenge, but a moral catastrophe. The planners understood this. Their records, such as they survive, suggest that the psychological burden of working with this number was significant, and that different individuals in the planning structure processed it in very different ways. The selection criteria for Exodus evacuation went through multiple iterations during the planning phase. Early proposals focused heavily on technical skills, prioritizing people whose knowledge and capabilities would be most useful in building a new civilization from scratch. Later proposals added criteria related to genetic diversity, arguing that preserving human biological potential required deliberate attention to the composition of the evacuee population. Political criteria entered the picture as the program became more widely known among those with power, with governance structures at various levels claiming seats for their own key personnel. And throughout all of this, the simple human criterion of who had the money, influence, or connections to secure a place was operating in the background, never formally acknowledged but always structurally present. The official narrative of the Exodus program was one of scientific rationality and altruistic intention. The selection process was presented in the communications designed for internal morale and the limited public messaging that was eventually released as a careful, evidence-based process designed to maximize the probability of human survival and civilizational continuity. The unofficial reality, as the law fragments suggest it, was considerably messier. The gap between the official story and the lived experience of the selection process was one of the deepest sources of grievance in the social environment around the spaceport. People who were excluded from consideration, who watched others with fewer credentials but more connections receive selections that they deserved, carried a justified anger that manifested in various ways in the facility's social life. Resistance movements that formed around the Exodus program took multiple forms. Some were organized opposition groups arguing for democratization of the selection process, Some were direct action groups attempting to breach spaceport security to get people onto the shuttles who'd been excluded from official selection. Some were political movements arguing that the entire program was immoral, that the resources should be redirected to planetary defense rather than departure. And some were simply communities of people who were left behind, who had processed the reality that they were not going anywhere, and who were trying to figure out what survival on Earth looked like in the absence of any official support structure. The law treats all of these responses as legitimate, as understandable products of a situation that offered no good options. The engineering development timeline for the Exodus shuttles was one of the most compressed in history. The basic architecture of the shuttles drew on existing aerospace knowledge, but required significant advances in several key areas to achieve the capacity and reliability needed for the program. Materials science, propulsion efficiency, life support systems, radiation shielding, autonomous navigation, all of these were areas where the engineering teams pushed the boundaries of what was technically achievable. The pace of that development meant that testing was compressed, that some failure modes that would normally have been discovered and addressed in a longer development process were not caught until relatively late. The law is careful not to specify the exact technical failures that resulted, but hints at them in the way it describes certain aspects of the program's history. Manufacturing the shuttles required a global industrial mobilization that was one of the most impressive and least celebrated achievements of the pre-collapse period. Components were fabricated in facilities across multiple continents and then transported to the spaceport for final assembly. Coordinating that supply chain under the increasingly difficult conditions of the pre-collapse world required logistics systems of extraordinary complexity. The people who ran those logistics systems were not glamorous figures. They were operations specialists, procurement managers, supply chain coordinators, doing unglamorous work with enormous consequences. Their contribution to the Exodus program is mostly invisible in the official history, but without it, no shuttle would ever have left the ground. The propulsion systems of the Exodus shuttles represent some of the most impressive technology visible in the spaceport environment. The scale of the engine systems required to lift vessels of the shuttle's size is reflected in the physical scale of the launch infrastructure. The enormous thrust deflection systems, the fuel feed lines that dwarf the people who maintained them, the structural reinforcements that allowed the gantry systems to survive the forces involved in a launch. Walking through the propulsion infrastructure of the spaceports as a raider today, you are moving through spaces that were once defined by almost incomprehensible physical force. The stillness of those spaces now, the way they sit heavy and quiet in the arc-guarded ruin, is one of the more effective contrasts the map creates. Life support systems for the shuttles were a particular engineering challenge. People in space need air, water, food, temperature regulation, and protection from radiation. And they need all of these things to function reliably for the duration of a journey that could last years or decades, depending on the destination. The life support technology developed for the Exodus program drew on decades of previous research and experience, but required substantial advances to work at the scale and duration required. The life support systems also had to function with minimal intervention, because the shuttles could not carry large maintenance crews. They had to be robust, redundant, and as close to self-sustaining as engineering could make them. Whether they actually achieved that in practice is a question the law raises without fully answering. Navigation was one of the most technically sophisticated aspects of the Exodus program. Shuttles leaving Earth needed to navigate to a destination that was either orbital or considerably further out, using autonomous systems that could operate without real-time ground control input. The navigation technology developed for the program combined stellar positioning, inertial guidance, and computational systems that were at the leading edge of what was achievable at the time. The law suggests that navigation was an area where significant investment was made and where the program achieved results it could be genuinely proud of, systems that worked reliably and performed close to their design specifications. This was not universally true of all the program's technical achievements, which makes the navigation success a small point of light in an otherwise complicated technical history. The crew selection for the shuttles was a separate process from the passenger selection, though the two were obviously related. Shuttle crews needed to be technically capable of managing the vessel and its systems, physically and psychologically suited to long-duration spaceflight, and selected in a way that was at least somewhat insulated from the political pressures that were deforming the passenger selection process. How well the program managed this separation is unclear from the available lore, but the evidence suggests that crew selection was somewhat more merit-based than passenger selection, partly because the planners understood that a shuttle with a technically incompetent crew was a threat to everyone on board, and partly because the technical skill requirements provided a defensible selection criterion that was harder to manipulate than more general ones. The emotional experience of the selection process for those who went through it is one of the most humanly resonant aspects of the Exodus program's history. Being told you had been selected to leave Earth was not an unambiguously positive experience. It was a complicated one, carrying the weight of knowing you would leave behind people you loved, places you were attached to, a world that was the only world you had ever known. The lore captures this complexity in fragments, in the traces of personal records and environmental details that suggest people who were going experienced something more like grief than triumph. The story of the Exodus is not a story of people escaping joyfully to a better future. It is a story of people carrying the weight of what they were leaving, even as they accepted the necessity of going. The people who were not selected and who knew they were not going had their own experience, distinct from and in many ways more difficult than the experience of those who were selected. Being left behind was not a neutral fact. It was a judgment, or at least it felt like one, a determination that your life was less worth preserving than the lives of the people who received selections. The fact that this judgment was made on criteria that were often unfair or corrupt made it worse rather than better. The anger, grief, and despair that characterized the experience of being left behind produced one of the most volatile social environments in the history of the spaceport, and the physical evidence of that volatility is part of what you're walking through when you navigate the facility's ruins. Information management around the Exodus program became increasingly difficult as time passed and as more people became aware of what was actually happening. The early phase of the program, conducted in near total secrecy, was eventually followed by a phase of partial disclosure, and eventually by a phase of essentially open knowledge, where the program was widely understood even if officially still classified in many respects. The transition through these phases created enormous social stress. People who had known early and had been managing that knowledge in silence for years found themselves in situations where the burden was finally shared, but also finally undeniable. People who were learning for the first time had to process it rapidly in a social environment that was already highly stressed. The diplomatic dimension of the Exodus program is one of its least documented aspects, but it was almost certainly significant. Decisions about who was in charge of the program, which nations had meaningful influence over the selection process, which technical agreements governed the shuttle technology, which orbital or deep space infrastructure was shared and which was exclusive, all of these required negotiation at the highest levels of whatever global governance structures existed. The law hints at agreements that were made and broken, at relationships between power centers that were defined by the program's distribution of benefit and burden, at conflicts that were managed diplomatically in public, but that expressed themselves as distortions in the program's operations. The politics of who controlled the Exodus program shaped its outcomes in ways that the law acknowledges without fully itemizing. The Exodus program's relationship to Earth's remaining scientific and cultural institutions is a poignant thread in the larger story. There were deliberate efforts to preserve representative samples of human, cultural, and scientific achievement on the shuttles to carry something of what civilization had built beyond Earth's atmosphere. Libraries in digital form, seed banks, cultural archives, samples of biological and geological material, all of these were factored into the cargo planning for the shuttles. The selection of what to preserve was itself a kind of judgment about what mattered most, about what humanity most needed to take with it. Those judgments are embedded in the program's history, reflecting the values and priorities of the people who made them. The role of private funding in the Exodus program is something the law touches on with a certain careful ambiguity. Large-scale infrastructure projects in the pre-collapse world were rarely funded purely by governmental sources, and the Exodus program was no exception. Private capital was involved in the construction of the spaceport and in the development of the shuttle technology, and that involvement came with strings. The entities that contributed private capital to the program expected and, in many cases, received consideration in the allocation of evacuation places. The blurring of public benefit and private interests that characterized the funding of the Exodus program is one of its more uncomfortable aspects, a reminder that even in the face of civilizational catastrophe, the mechanisms of private advantage were still operating. The timeline pressure of the Exodus program created a culture of deferred problems. There was always a reason to push a problem into the future, rather than dealing with it now. Always a more pressing issue that justified postponing the resolution of something difficult. This deferred problem culture had consequences, issues that should have been addressed early, in the selection criteria, in the safety testing, in the community relations work around the facility, accumulated and eventually manifested in crises that were harder to manage precisely because they had been ignored for so long. The law's picture of the Exodus program is in some ways a picture of an institution running faster and faster, achieving impressive things, while a growing list of unresolved problems built up in its wake. The psychological preparation of evacuees for long-duration spaceflight was a significant program within the broader Exodus effort. People who had lived their entire lives on Earth, who had never experienced sustained weightlessness, who had no practical understanding of what it meant to be in a sealed vessel in the void for an extended period, needed preparation. The program that provided this preparation was intensive and based on the fragments that remain, not entirely successful. The psychological challenges of deep space travel were not fully solvable through pre-departure training, because some of them could only be understood by living through them. The law hints at the psychological outcomes of the journey for those who undertook it, outcomes that were not uniformly positive, even among those who survived physically. The cargo manifest of the Exodus shuttles was a contested document, subject to revision, negotiation, and in some cases outright manipulation, right up to the moment of launch. Officially, the cargo was optimized for survival and civilizational reconstruction, carrying the tools, materials, knowledge, and biological resources needed to build something new. Unofficially, personal cargo was a site of significant abuse, with selected passengers using their status and connections to bring things that were personally meaningful but had no survival value, at the cost of cargo space that could have been used for things that mattered. The stories embedded in the cargo manifests, if they were ever fully reconstructed, would be one of the most revealing documents of the program's human reality. The last days of the Exodus program, as the collapse accelerated and the launch windows narrowed, were characterized by a desperate compression of timelines that pushed every system to its limits. Launches that had been scheduled with careful attention to preparation and safety were conducted at increasing speed as the deteriorating situation outside the spaceport demanded. The safety trade-offs made in those last phases of the program are part of its complicated legacy, decisions that were pragmatically justified given the alternative, but that represented compromises from the standards the program had nominally committed to. The fragments that remain from that final period suggest an institution operating at the edge of its capabilities, aware that it was making concessions but unable to find any way to avoid them. The Exodus program's handling of disability and medical need is another of its ethically complex dimensions. The selection criteria favoured health and physical capability, partly for genuine survival reasons and partly for the less defensible reason that people with significant medical needs required more resources and generated more uncertainty. The exclusion of people with disabilities and serious medical conditions from consideration was rarely made explicit in official communications, but was effectively built into the selection process. The people who were excluded on these grounds, and who understood why they had been excluded, experienced a particular kind of institutional rejection that the law acknowledges in its fragmentary way without ever making it a central narrative. The educational mission embedded in the Exodus program is one of its more forward-looking aspects. The planners understood that the generation born after the evacuation, wherever they ended up, would need to rebuild civilization, essentially from scratch in important respects. The knowledge base carried on the shuttles was designed not just to preserve information, but to support the transmission of knowledge across generations, to give future educators the materials they would need to teach the next generation how to do the things human civilization needed to be able to do. This educational mission shaped what was selected for preservation and how it was organized, and it reflects a dimension of the program that was genuinely oriented toward the future, rather than just the survival of the present. The language barriers within the Exodus program were a practical challenge that shaped the facility's culture. A global program drawing workers and evacuees from across the world meant that the spaceport was a multilingual environment, requiring translation, interpretation, and the management of communication across multiple languages simultaneously. The official language of the program was presumably a matter of political decision as much as practical utility, and the choice of which language or languages would be used for critical communications was itself a site of cultural and political tension. The linguistic diversity of the spaceport's population left traces in the facility's environment, in signage, in artifacts, in the cultural expressions that workers and residents left behind. The media management of the Exodus program is a fascinating dimension of its history. There were journalists and documentarians who knew about the program, or who suspected, and who were working to cover it against significant official resistance. The institutional response to this journalistic interest ranged from strategic disclosure, where certain controlled information was released to shape the narrative, to active suppression, where reporting that went too far was blocked through legal and extra-legal means. The history of what was reported and what was suppressed about the Exodus program during its operational period is itself a kind of document of institutional values and priorities. The fragments that survive in the law suggest a program that was deeply uncomfortable with transparency, even when transparency might have served its long-term goals. The music and arts of the spaceport community are among the traces of human life that are hardest to recover from the environmental record, but most resonant when you do. People at the spaceport made music. They created art. They performed. These were not just recreational activities. In a community living with the knowledge of what was happening and what was coming, creative expression was a survival tool, a way of processing experience that could not be fully processed through official channels. The cultural life of the spaceport was rich in ways that the institutional record does not capture, and the fragments of it that survive in the environmental details of the map are among the most humanizing aspects of the facility's story. The relationship between the Exodus program and Ark's behavior is one of the more strategically interesting questions the lore raises. Did Ark accelerate its activity in response to the launches? Did the launches somehow draw Ark attention in ways that had not been anticipated? The lore suggests, without confirming, that there may be a relationship between the Exodus program's activity and certain shifts in Ark behavior. This possibility, if it is more than speculation, raises uncomfortable questions about whether the launches themselves contributed to the acceleration of the collapse, whether the act of departing changed the threat calculus in ways that made things worse for those who remained. This is one of the Exodus program's most morally complex open questions. The organizational structure of the Exodus program evolved significantly over its operational period, reflecting the changing conditions under which it operated and the learning that came from the early phases. What began as a relatively hierarchical, centralized command structure gradually developed more distributed decision-making as the scale of the operation grew and as communication across the program's various components became increasingly difficult due to the deteriorating global situation. The middle management of the Exodus program, the layer of administrators and technical leads who implemented policy rather than made it, were among the most important people in the program's practical success, and they are among the least documented. Their stories, embedded in the facility's operational records, are part of the archive that the Spaceport's ruins may still contain. The final passenger lists, the names of people who actually boarded the shuttles and left Earth, are among the most historically significant and most carefully managed documents of the Exodus program. The lore suggests that these lists were subject to last-minute changes, that people were added and removed under various forms of pressure right up to the moment of launch, and that the process of finalizing them was one of the most chaotic and ethically fraught aspects of the entire operation. Whether complete copies of these lists exist anywhere in the physical record is unknown, but the Spaceport's archives, if they are ever accessed, would likely contain at least partial versions of them. The Exodus program produced a generation of specialists whose expertise was defined almost entirely by the demands of the program itself. Shuttle engineers, launch coordinators, orbital mechanics experts, life support system technicians, all of these were people whose skills were specifically developed for this one mission, and whose identities became deeply tied to it. When the program ended, whether through completion or through the collapse overtaking it, these people faced a particular kind of identity crisis. Their purpose suddenly gone, their specialized knowledge having limited applicability in the world that was emerging around them. The fate of these program specialists is another open thread in the Spaceport's human history. One of the more quietly devastating aspects of the Exodus program is the evidence that some people who'd been selected for evacuation chose not to go. The reasons varied. Some could not bring themselves to leave people they loved who had not been selected. Some simply could not accept the physical reality of leaving Earth permanently. Some made last-minute decisions to stay based on moral objections to the selection process. The lore hints at a small but significant number of individuals who had evacuation places and voluntarily gave them up or simply did not board when their shuttle launched. Their choice was not celebrated, it was barely recorded, but it was a choice that carries extraordinary moral weight, and the Spaceport is partly their monument too. The supply of personal protective equipment and safety gear for the launch operations was another of the unglamorous logistical challenges that shaped the Spaceport's operational culture. People working near active launch systems faced significant physical risks, from the acoustic intensity of the launches to the chemical hazards of the fuels to the structural risks of the launch infrastructure itself. The safety culture of the Spaceport was reasonably well developed by industrial standards, but operated under the same time pressures that compressed safety protocols across the entire program. Injuries and fatalities among the facility's workforce were not uncommon, and the management of these incidents was another area where the gap between official communication and operational reality was significant. The archives of scientific data produced by the Exodus program represent one of the potentially most valuable resources buried in the Spaceport's ruins. Not just mission data and technical records, but the scientific research that was conducted at the facility over its operational period, research on arc units, on environmental conditions, on biological adaptation, on the physics of the launch systems themselves. This data, if it could be recovered and understood, might shed light on questions that are still deeply relevant to the world of Ark Raiders. Questions about what Ark is, what it wants, and whether there is any way to change the relationship between Ark and the humans who are still trying to survive on Earth. The interoperability challenges of the Exodus program, the difficulties of making systems developed by different engineering teams in different countries using different standards work together reliably, were a persistent source of technical risk. A shuttle is an integrated system, and if its components do not communicate and function together correctly, the consequences are catastrophic. The program developed integration protocols and testing regimes to manage this risk, but the compressed timeline meant that these could not always be as thorough as the engineers would have wanted. The evidence suggests that integration failures were a category of problem that the program was always managing, that the test and verification processes caught most but not all of the issues before they manifested in the field. The Exodus program's legacy for Earth itself, for the billions of people who were not evacuated and who had to face the collapse without the support of the program's resources, is one of the most morally fraught aspects of the entire story. The resources that went into the Exodus program were enormous, and they came from an Earth that desperately needed those resources for other purposes. The argument that the program's architects made, that saving some was better than saving none, was not wrong on its face, but it was made in a context where the definition of some was heavily shaped by factors that had nothing to do with who deserved to survive. The moral accounting of the Exodus program is one of the deepest unresolved questions in the lore of Ark Raiders. The Exodus program's relationship to the concept of humanity is ultimately its most profound dimension. What does it mean to preserve humanity? Is it enough to preserve individual human lives? Do you also need to preserve culture, history, language, place, and the specific textures of human experience that make life meaningful? The program took a particular answer to these questions, one that emphasized biological and technical preservation while necessarily leaving behind much of the cultural and experiential richness that makes human civilization what it is. The Spaceport is the monument to that answer, the physical embodiment of a set of choices about what humanity is and what it is worth preserving. Whether those choices were right is one of the questions the lore invites you to sit with. The communication systems designed to allow continued contact between the evacuated population and Earth after the launches were among the most aspirationally optimistic technical achievements of the program. The idea was that the connection would not be entirely severed, that information would flow between Earth and wherever the shuttles had gone, that the people who left and the people who stayed would remain linked in some meaningful way. The lore is suggestive that this aspiration was not achieved, that the communication systems either failed, were disrupted by Ark, or proved technically inadequate for the distances involved. The silence between Earth and wherever the Exodus survivors went is one of the defining features of the world of Ark Raiders, and it is a silence that begins with the failure of these communication systems. The food carried on the Exodus shuttles was a significant planning exercise in itself. Long-duration space travel requires food that is calorie-dense, shelf-stable, and storable in compact form, but that also meets the nutritional needs of a population that cannot receive medical treatment for deficiency diseases the way they could on Earth. The food systems developed for the shuttles drew on decades of space nutrition research and expanded on it considerably, given the much longer duration and much larger population involved. The lore hints at the food culture of the shuttle communities, the meals that became standard, the creative adaptations that people made within the constraints of the system, the social rituals that formed around eating in a population that had little else to structure their shared time. The Exodus program produced a series of what might be called departure artifacts, objects, and documents that were created specifically in the context of people leaving Earth for the last time. Some of these were official, commissioned by the program itself as a kind of institutional record of the departure. Others were personal, created by individuals who wanted to mark the moment of leaving in some way that felt adequate to its significance. These artifacts, scattered through the spaceport's environment in the form of details that careful observation can identify, are among the most emotionally direct pieces of lore in the facility. They are the evidence of people trying to be present to an experience that was simply too large to be fully processed in the moment of living through it. The training simulations used to prepare shuttle crews for the conditions they would face are another of the spaceport's technological legacies. To prepare people for an environment that cannot be adequately experienced on the ground, the program developed simulation systems of considerable sophistication, designed to approximate the conditions of deep space travel in ways that could be used in pre-departure preparation. The simulation facilities at the spaceport, if they survive in any recoverable form in the current ruins, would be a significant piece of the facility's technological legacy. Whether ARC has any interest in these systems, or whether they simply remain as inert infrastructure, is an open question. The departure rituals that developed spontaneously among the spaceport's population, distinct from any officially sanctioned ceremony, are one of the most humanizing aspects of the facility's social history. In communities facing extreme transitions, people develop rituals as a way of marking what is ending and what is beginning. The departure rituals of the spaceport, the specific ways that people said goodbye to Earth, to each other, to their previous lives, are suggested in fragmentary form by the environmental details of the map. These were not simple or uniform. They reflected the diversity of the people who went through the facility, their different cultural backgrounds, their different beliefs, their different ways of processing an experience that had no real precedent. The Exodus program's contribution to material culture is visible in the objects that remain in the spaceport's environment. The program produced a distinctive material world characterized by the functional aesthetic of industrial technology operated under emergency conditions, by the specific forms of objects designed to work in space, and by the personal objects that people brought with them from their previous lives. The layering of these different material traditions in the spaceport's environment creates a rich archaeological record for players who move through the space carefully, attending to what is there and what it suggests about the people who put it there. The political consequences of the Exodus program for the governance structures that remained on Earth are another underexplored dimension of the larger story. When the shuttles left, they took with them significant portions of the political, technical, and economic leadership of the societies that had launched them. The vacuum that created in the midst of an ongoing civilizational crisis had profound consequences for the people who were left behind. The governance structures that had to fill that vacuum, or that emerged in the absence of any effective governance, were shaped by the absence of the expertise and authority that had departed. The social and political fragmentation that characterized the post-Exodus period on Earth was partly a product of the departures themselves. The Exodus program's treatment of knowledge as a survival resource is one of its most forward-looking and genuinely admirable aspects. the deliberate effort to carry human knowledge beyond Earth to ensure that the accumulated learning of human civilization would not be lost even if Earth became uninhabitable, represents a kind of civilizational foresight that is rare in human history. The specific choices made about what knowledge to preserve and in what form are themselves a document of what the program's architects valued and what they thought the future would need. Those choices, embedded in the cargo manifests and the design of the knowledge preservation systems, are part of the intellectual legacy of the Exodus program, a legacy that the spaceport still houses in fragmentary form. The final launches of the Exodus program, whenever exactly they occurred and under whatever conditions, represent the culmination of an enormous human effort to persist in the face of what seemed like extinction. Whether all of those final launches were successful, whether the shuttles that left in the last phase of the program reached their intended destinations, whether the people on board survived the journey, all of these remain open questions in the lore. What is known is that the launches happened, that the spaceport made them possible, and that, after they were done, the facility fell silent. The silence of the spaceport after the last launch is one of the most profound moments in the entire history that we are tracing in this video, and it is in that silence that ARC first began to make the spaceport its own. Chapter 3: Building the Spaceport, the Architecture of Hope. The physical structure of the spaceport is a document of the intentions and capabilities of the people who built it. Architecture is always a form of communication, a way of encoding values, ambitions, and understandings of the world into physical form, and the spaceport's architecture communicates a great deal about the civilization that produced it. The facility was built to function, first and foremost. Every major system was designed to support the specific operational requirements of a launch facility. But it was also built to mean something, to be a physical expression of the ambition and commitment that the Exodus program represented. The tension between these two imperatives, pure function and meaningful form, is visible throughout the spaceport's design, and it is part of what makes the facility so compelling to explore. The site selection for the spaceport was a major technical and strategic exercise. Multiple candidate locations were evaluated against a comprehensive set of criteria before the final site was chosen. The evaluation considered proximity to the equator for orbital launch efficiency, geological stability of the substrate, access to water and other utilities, existing infrastructure that could be repurposed or extended, strategic defensibility, distance from population centers, and the political feasibility of acquiring the necessary land. The final site represented the best available compromise between these competing criteria, and the compromises are visible in the facility's design, in the ways it had to adapt to the specific characteristics of its location rather than being built in an idealized setting. Foundation work for the spaceport was the first major engineering challenge of the construction process. The loads that the launch systems would impose on the ground were enormous, and the foundation systems had to be designed to transmit those loads safely into the substrate without catastrophic settlement or failure. The geotechnical investigations that preceded the foundation design revealed conditions that required significant engineering response, and the foundation systems that were ultimately built are among the most substantial structural elements of the entire facility. Walking through the spaceport today, most of what supports the facility is underground, invisible, but it is that invisible foundation that made everything else possible. The gantry structures of the spaceport are its most iconic visual elements. These tall skeletal frameworks that supported the shuttles during preparation and launch are engineering structures of considerable elegance, achieving their function with a directness that makes them visually impressive, even in their current ruined state. The gantries had to be capable of supporting the weight of fully loaded shuttles, while providing access to the vehicles at multiple levels for servicing and preparation, all while being capable of rapid retraction before a launch. The engineering requirements were demanding, and the structures that met those requirements are among the more impressive technical achievements visible in the spaceport environment. Thermal management was a critical design consideration throughout the spaceport's building process. Launch operations generate enormous amounts of heat, both from the propulsion systems during launch and from the various energy-intensive processes that support launch preparation. The facility had to be designed to manage this heat without allowing it to compromise the structural integrity of the buildings or the health of the people working within them. The thermal management systems at the spaceport, including heat deflectors, ventilation systems, and the spatial organization of heat-generating facilities relative to inhabited spaces, represent a significant engineering achievement that is less visually obvious than the gantries but equally important to the facility's function. The control tower complex of the spaceport was the nerve center of launch operations. This is where the data from all of the facility's monitoring systems was integrated, where launch decisions were made and communicated, and where the most critical personnel were positioned during the most critical moments of the operational cycle. The control tower's design reflects its importance. It was built with redundancy, with blast protection, with communication systems that could function even under conditions of significant external disruption. The physical prominence of the control tower in the spaceport's layout communicates the centrality of its function to the facility's mission. Even in ruins, the control tower maintains an authoritative presence in the spaceport's visual landscape. Processing buildings at the spaceport were designed to manage the complex sequences of preparation that preceded a launch. These were not simple storage facilities. They were sophisticated operational environments where the shuttles and their cargo, including their human cargo, were prepared for flight. The layout of the processing buildings reflects the sequential logic of the preparation process, with spaces organized to move people and materials through the stages of launch preparation in an efficient and controlled manner. The design of these spaces also had to accommodate the emotional reality of what was happening within them, spaces where people were making final preparations to leave the planet. The architecture tried to manage this reality without being overwhelmed by it. The fuel infrastructure of the spaceport is one of its most physically substantial elements. Storage tanks for the enormous quantities of propellant required for the shuttle launches were among the first major structures built at the site, because without fuel, nothing else was possible. The scale of the fuel storage and handling systems reflects the scale of the launches they supported. These were not small amounts of propellant. They were reserves measured in millions of litres, stored under pressure in tanks designed to survive the operational environment of an active launch facility. The fuel infrastructure shaped the layout of the entire spaceport because the tanks' requirements for access, safety exclusion zones, and transport routes influenced where other facilities could and could not be placed. Acoustic management was one of the less obvious but significant engineering challenges of the spaceport's design. A shuttle launch is one of the most acoustically intense events that human engineering produces, generating sound levels that can cause structural damage and severe physiological harm at short distances. The spaceport's layout reflects deliberate acoustic planning, with inhabited facilities sited at distances and orientations that minimize the impact of launch acoustics on the people within them. Blast deflection walls, acoustic barriers, and building orientations that use the facility's own structures as shields were all elements of the acoustic management strategy. These design features are visible in the spatial organization of the spaceport if you look for them, though they are not always immediately obvious as acoustic engineering rather than general site planning. The medical facilities of the spaceport were built to a higher specification than typical industrial medical facilities. The population served by these facilities included both the regular workforce and the evacuee population awaiting launch, and both groups had significant medical needs. The medical complex at the spaceport was capable of handling everything from routine occupational health to serious trauma and complex medical interventions. It was also, in the later operational phases, one of the primary sites for the final health assessments of passengers before launch. The medical facilities tell a story of an institution that took the physical well-being of its population seriously, at least in infrastructure terms, even if the systemic stresses of the facility's operation created health challenges that those facilities were not always able to fully address. Water management at the spaceport was a multifaceted engineering challenge. The facility needed large quantities of water for the launch systems themselves, for the cooling systems that manage the thermal loads of the propulsion infrastructure, for the domestic needs of the facility's population, and for fire suppression systems. The water supply system had to be designed to meet all of these demands simultaneously, with priority routing that could ensure critical systems always had water, even if domestic supplies were temporarily constrained. The water management infrastructure is a significant element of the spaceport's physical layout, represented by the network of pipes, tanks, and distribution systems that served the facility's various water needs. Waste management at the spaceport reflected the facility's status as a self-contained community operating for an extended period. Industrial waste from the manufacturing and maintenance operations, human waste from the population, chemical waste from the laboratory and technical functions, hazardous waste from the propulsion systems, all of these had to be managed and disposed of in ways that did not compromise the facility's operation or the health of its population. The waste management systems at the spaceport were sophisticated by any standard, reflecting both the genuine engineering capability of the people who built them and the regulatory frameworks that governed industrial operations in the pre-collapse world. Structural redundancy was built into the spaceport's critical systems in ways that reflect the facility's planners' understanding of the consequences of failure. For a facility with no tolerance for catastrophic failure, single points of failure in critical systems were unacceptable. Backup power systems, redundant communication pathways, alternative fueling routes, parallel launch control systems, all of these redundancies were designed into the facility from the beginning. The physical evidence of this redundancy is visible in the doubled and tripled systems that appear throughout the spaceport's infrastructure, in the backup facilities that shadow the primary ones, in the alternative pathways and connections that link different parts of the facility. This redundancy is part of what makes the spaceport such an interesting environment to explore, because the layers of backup and alternative infrastructure create a complexity that simple single-function spaces never have. The security infrastructure of the spaceport was both physical and procedural. Physical security elements, perimeter barriers, access control points, surveillance systems, patrol infrastructure were built into the facility's design from the beginning. But physical security was only part of the picture. The procedural security systems, the protocols and clearance systems that determined who could go where and do what within the facility were equally important. The interaction between the physical and procedural dimensions of the spaceport's security produced an environment that was highly controlled but also highly complex, where understanding how to navigate the facility was itself a form of expertise. The aesthetic choices made in the spaceport's design are evidence of a conscious decision not to sacrifice everything to pure function. Certain areas of the facility show deliberate attention to visual quality, to the relationship between elements, to the experience of people moving through the space. This is particularly true in the departure areas where the emotional significance of what was happening clearly influenced the architectural approach. The departure spaces are not beautiful in an ornate or decorative sense. They are beautiful in the way that an honest building is beautiful, in the way that materials used well and spaces organized thoughtfully create an environment that feels both functional and humane. This quality of architectural care is one of the things that makes the Spaceport feel like more than just a backdrop. The scale transitions within the Spaceport are one of its most effective spatial experiences. Moving from the enormous scales of the launch infrastructure to the more human scales of the inhabited spaces creates a spatial rhythm that has its own dramatic quality. You pass through spaces that dwarf you and remind you of the ambition of what was built here, and then you move into spaces that are scaled to the human body, to the conversations and meals and rest that people needed even in the middle of the largest project in human history. These scale transitions are not accidental. They are the product of design intelligence that understood the experience of the people who would use the facility and organize the space to support that experience. Construction materials used at the Spaceport reflect both the technical requirements of the facility and the material constraints of the pre-collapse world. The primary structural materials are the heavy industrial staples of modern construction: concrete, steel, reinforced composite systems, but they are used in ways that reflect the specific demands of a launch facility. High-strength concrete capable of withstanding the ground shock of launches, steel grades selected for their resistance to the chemical environment of the propulsion systems, composite materials in areas where weight reduction was critical. The material choices tell a story of engineering pragmatism, of decisions made on the basis of performance requirements, rather than appearance or convention. Lighting at the Spaceport was both functional and communicative. Different areas of the facility had different lighting conditions that reflected their different functions and the different experiences they were designed to support. Work areas were lit for efficiency and visual accuracy. Processing and preparation areas were lit to support the careful, detailed work of launch preparation. Inhabited spaces were lit to support the well-being of people living and working in an environment that was often stressful and always high stakes. And certain transitional spaces, the spaces associated with departure, were lit in ways that acknowledged the emotional weight of what was happening in them. The lighting design of the Spaceport is something that the environmental artists of the game have translated into the current state of the map, where natural light, arc illumination, and the residual glow of still functioning systems create a layered lighting environment that is one of the map's most atmospheric qualities. Ventilation and air quality management were significant design considerations throughout the Spaceport. A facility that included active propulsion systems, large industrial processes, densely occupied living areas, and laboratory functions needed sophisticated air management to maintain the health and safety of its population. The ventilation systems at the Spaceport were designed to handle the specific air quality challenges of each area, from the fume management needs of the propulsion facilities to the air exchange requirements of the inhabited spaces. The ventilation infrastructure is one of the less visually dramatic elements of the facility's design, but one of the more critical, and its traces are visible throughout the map in the form of ductwork, grills, and mechanical rooms that have outlasted most of the other building systems. Circulation and access planning at the Spaceport reflects the facility's need to move large numbers of people and vehicles efficiently through a complex site while maintaining the security and operational integrity of each area. The circulation systems of the Spaceport, the roads, corridors, access routes, and controlled pathways that connected its various functions were designed to support the flow requirements of normal operations while also providing the means to manage emergency conditions. The design of these circulation systems imposed a particular kind of spatial logic on the facility, a logic that is still readable in the map's layout and that shapes the player's experience of moving through the space. The integration of the spaceport's various functional areas was one of the most complex design challenges the architects faced. A launch facility includes many different types of space, each with its own specific requirements, and getting them to work together as a coherent whole required careful attention to their relationships. The layout of the spaceport reflects the priorities that emerged from this integration work. The decisions about which functions needed to be adjacent, which needed to be separated, and which needed to be connected in specific ways to support the operational flow of the facility. These layout decisions are visible to players who pay attention to the spatial logic of the map, and they communicate something about the priorities and values of the people who designed the facility. The spaceport's relationship to its site, to the specific characteristics of the land it was built on, is visible in the way the facility's layout responds to topography, geology, and hydrology. Buildings are positioned to take advantage of natural features that support their function and to avoid features that would compromise it. The relationship between the facility and the natural landscape it was built within was not entirely adversarial, even if it involved significant modification of the site. There are places in the spaceport where the architecture acknowledges the landscape rather than simply overriding it, where the built form and the natural form are in a kind of dialogue. These moments of acknowledgement are among the more subtle but resonant aspects of the facility's environmental character. Emergency systems throughout the spaceport were designed with a thoroughness that reflects the consequences of failure in this type of facility. Fire suppression, emergency evacuation routes, blast containment, chemical spill response, medical emergency protocols, all of these had physical infrastructure embedded in the building design that is still visible in the current state of the map. The emergency infrastructure of the spaceport tells a story of careful risk analysis and responsible planning, of people who understood what could go wrong and built the capacity to respond to it. Whether all of the emergencies that were planned for actually occurred during the facility's operational period is not fully documented in the available law, but the range of the emergency planning suggests a realistic assessment of the risks involved. The communication infrastructure within the spaceport, distinct from the external communication systems that connected it to the outside world, was a sophisticated internal network. Voice communication, data communication, control signals, alarm systems, all of these required a physical infrastructure of cables, wireless systems, control nodes, and processing centers. The internal communication network of the spaceport was designed with redundancy and resilience in mind, because communication failures in a launch facility environment could have catastrophic consequences. The physical traces of this internal network are visible throughout the map, in the cable management systems, junction boxes, and communication equipment that populate the facility's infrastructure. The structural approach to blast resistance throughout the spaceport reflects the facility's awareness of the physical forces involved in its operations. Buildings near the launch systems were designed to withstand blast overpressure from potential propulsion failures. Control and operations buildings were designed to maintain their structural integrity under conditions that would compromise ordinary construction. The blast resistance engineering at the spaceport is evidence of both technical caution and a realistic assessment of the risks of operating at the edge of what was technically achievable. The heavy, solid quality of certain buildings in the spaceport environment, their fortress-like character, is partly a product of this blast resistance engineering. The design of the inhabited spaces at the spaceport went through multiple iterations as the program developed and as the planners gained a clearer understanding of how many people would be living there and for how long. Early designs assumed a more transient population, workers who would rotate in and out of the facility on regular schedules. As the program extended in duration, and as the deteriorating external conditions made regular rotation increasingly difficult, The inhabited spaces had to be adapted for a more permanent population. The evidence of these adaptations is visible in the spaceport's built fabric, in additions and modifications that were made to spaces designed for one purpose in order to serve a different one. Natural light penetration in the spaceport's design was more carefully considered than you might expect from a purely industrial facility. The planners understood that people spending extended periods in an artificially lit environment suffered psychological effects that undermined their performance and well-being. So the inhabited areas of the spaceport were designed with attention to natural light, using windows, skylights, and atriums where the operational requirements of the spaces permitted. This attention to natural light is one of the more humanistic dimensions of the spaceport's design, evidence of planning that considered the full experience of the people who would live and work there, not just their functional requirements. The exterior of the spaceport communicates a different message from its interior. From outside, the facility presents a deliberately imposing face, a set of structures that communicate authority, capability, and permanence. This was intentional. The spaceport was always going to be visible to the communities around it, and its visual presence was a form of communication to those communities. It said that something significant was happening here, that the facility and its mission were serious, that the human response to the threat was real and substantial. This exterior communication was not purely propaganda. The facility was genuinely significant, genuinely capable. But the deliberateness of its visual expression tells you something about the sophistication of the institutional thinking that shaped its design. Interior wayfinding at the spaceport was a significant design challenge, given the complexity of the facility and the variety of people moving through it. Workers, technical specialists, security personnel, and eventually evacuees all needed to navigate the facility, often in conditions of stress and urgency. The wayfinding systems at the spaceport, the signage, spatial cues, color coding, and circulation design that helped people find their way were developed with a thoroughness that reflects the consequences of navigational failures in this environment. The remnants of these wayfinding systems are one of the more evocative elements of the spaceport's current state, signage pointing to functions that no longer exist, guiding phantom populations through spaces that are now empty. The energy systems of the spaceport were designed with a level of redundancy that reflects the critical importance of power to every aspect of the facility's operation. Primary generation, secondary generation, tertiary backup systems, emergency battery systems, power distribution, with multiple pathways to critical loads. All of these were elements of the power architecture. The physical infrastructure of these systems occupies significant portions of the spaceport's footprint in generator buildings, electrical rooms, transformer yards, and distribution infrastructure that served every part of the facility. The evidence of this power infrastructure is one of the more persistent elements of the spaceport's built fabric, surviving in forms that tell a story of both capability and eventual abandonment. The chemical storage and handling facilities at the spaceport tell a story of careful management of genuinely hazardous materials. Rocket propellants are among the most energetically concentrated and chemically aggressive materials that human industry handles, and the systems designed to store and handle them at the spaceport were correspondingly sophisticated. Containment systems, ventilation, spill response infrastructure, protective equipment storage, all of these were features of the chemical handling facilities. The physical remains of these facilities have an industrial intensity that communicates the reality of working with these materials, a reality that was a daily experience for certain categories of spaceport workers. The specific structural engineering of the launch pad infrastructure is visible in the physical details of the spaceport's launch areas. The geometry of the launch pad structures, the geometry of the thrust deflection systems, the scale of the structural supports, all of these communicate something about the forces involved in a launch and about the engineering approach taken to managing those forces. The launch pads are among the most technically interesting structures in the facility, representing the integration of mechanical engineering, structural engineering, and aerospace engineering in a set of systems that had to work perfectly together in the most extreme operating conditions the facility produced. The storage facilities at the spaceport were organized according to a careful logic that reflected the priority structures of the program. The most critical materials, irreplaceable components, essential propellant stocks were stored with the highest degree of protection and accessibility. Less critical materials were stored with appropriate but less intensive arrangements. The organization of storage across the facility tells a story of prioritization, of understood hierarchy in the value of different resources. The current state of these storage facilities, with whatever remains of their contents, is one of the more intriguing aspects of the spaceport's current environment for players who engage with the lore. The integration of the spaceport with its external transportation networks was a significant element of its site planning. Materials, personnel, and equipment had to flow into the facility from the outside world, and the spaceport's connections to road, rail, and other transportation infrastructure were designed to support these flows efficiently while maintaining the security requirements of the facility. The transportation connections also provided the means by which evacuees were brought to the facility for their departures, which added a human dimension to what were primarily logistical infrastructure decisions. The remnants of these transportation connections are part of the spaceport's broader site, extending the facility's footprint into the surrounding landscape. The design of the spaceport's administrative spaces reflects an institutional culture that balanced formality with functionality. Offices, meeting rooms, document storage, communication centers, all of the spatial requirements of managing a complex operation were provided within the facility's administrative areas. The design of these spaces was appropriately, but not extravagantly appointed, reflecting an organization that understood the importance of supporting the people who did its administrative work while not diverting resources from the operational mission. The administrative spaces are among the more archaeologically rich areas of the spaceport for players interested in the facility's human history, because administrative spaces accumulate the traces of institutional life in ways that purely operational spaces do not. Sound within the spaceport was managed not just acoustically, but aesthetically. The sound environment of different areas was understood as part of the experience of the space, and where the operational requirements permitted, efforts were made to shape that sound environment in ways that supported the well-being of the people in it. This attention to the acoustic quality of inhabited spaces is another marker of the spaceport's design sophistication, evidence of designers who thought about the full sensory experience of the people who would use the facility, not just the visual and spatial qualities. The design of the spaceport's perimeter was a significant exercise in balancing security with the practical need to maintain the facility's connections to the outside world. A perimeter that was completely impenetrable would also be completely dysfunctional, unable to receive the supplies, personnel, and information it needed to operate. The perimeter design had to create security without creating isolation, had to manage access without choking it. The solutions developed for this challenge are visible in the design of the facility's entry points, in the layering of security measures from the outer perimeter inward, and in the spatial organization of the zones adjacent to the perimeter. The technical documentation systems at the spaceport were built to support an organization managing highly complex, safety-critical operations. Every system, process, and procedure had documentation, not just as a bureaucratic requirement, but as a genuine operational necessity. The documentation systems, both the physical spaces where documents were stored and the electronic systems where they were created and accessed, were designed to make critical information readily available to the people who needed it, when they needed it, in a form they could use. The remains of these documentation systems, in whatever form they survive in the spaceport's current state, are potential sources of the most detailed information about the facility's operational history. The relationship between the spaceport's built form and the sky above it is one of the most resonant aspects of the facility's architectural character. A launch facility is, by definition, oriented toward the sky. The gantries reach upward. The launch pads are organized around the axis of departure. The control systems track what happens above the ground as much as what happens on it. This vertical orientation gives the spaceport a visual relationship with the sky that is unlike most other types of building, a relationship that was always about aspiration, about the desire to go up and out. The sky above the spaceport in the game, whether arc-haunted or occasionally clear, retains this quality of being not just background, but destination. The aging of the spaceport's materials over the period since the collapse is visible in the current state of the facility and tells its own story about the nature of what was built and the conditions it has endured. Different materials have aged differently. Concrete has weathered and cracked, but mostly held its form. Steel has corroded or exposed to moisture. Mechanical systems have seized or deteriorated to the point of immobility. Organic materials have decomposed entirely. The pattern of deterioration creates a kind of material chronology, a way of reading time in the substance of the buildings. The current state of the spaceport is not just ruin, it is ruin with a history, ruin that has been shaped by the specific character of what was built and the specific conditions of its abandonment and subsequent occupation. The underground spaces at the spaceport are among its most interesting and least explored dimensions. Any facility of this scale and complexity develops a significant underground infrastructure for utilities, for storage, for systems that need to be protected from the operational environment above. The underground portions of the spaceport likely contain some of the most intact elements of the facility's original construction, protected from the surface conditions that have deteriorated the above-ground structures. What might be found in the spaceport's underground spaces and what condition it might be in is one of the more intriguing aspects of the facility's law potential. The landscape immediately surrounding the spaceport was modified significantly during the facility's construction and operational period. Drainage management, approach roads, security clearance zones, blast exclusion areas, support facilities that could not be accommodated within the main complex, all created a built and modified landscape that extended well beyond the facility's formal perimeter. The relationship between the spaceport and this surrounding modified landscape is part of the broader spatial story of the facility. The game environment reflects this relationship in the way the map transitions from the intensive built environment of the facility itself to the modified landscape around it, and then to the more wild landscape beyond. The facilities for the maintenance of the shuttle vehicles themselves were among the most technically demanding spaces in the spaceport complex. Maintaining spacecraft is a different proposition from maintaining any other type of vehicle. The systems involved are more complex, the consequences of maintenance failure are more severe, and the environments in which maintenance is performed are more challenging. The maintenance facilities at the spaceport were built to support the specific demands of shuttle maintenance, with tooling, environmental controls, access infrastructure, and documentation systems, all tailored to the requirements of aerospace maintenance. These facilities are some of the more technically rich environments in the current map. Radiation protection was a design consideration in certain areas of the spaceport, primarily those associated with experimental systems or with the most energetically intensive aspects of the propulsion technology. The lore hints at propulsion research that pushed into territories where radiation management was a genuine concern, and the physical evidence of this in the form of shielded spaces and radiation monitoring infrastructure is part of the spaceport's environmental texture. Ark itself may have added radiation sources during its occupation of the facility, creating a situation where the original radiation management infrastructure interacts with new sources in ways that were not anticipated in the original design. The way the spaceport handles the transition from inside to outside is one of its more nuanced architectural qualities. Buildings that need to maintain environmental control while also accommodating large-scale movement of people and vehicles develop complex threshold conditions, airlocks, transition zones, controlled access volumes that manage the interface between the controlled interior and the uncontrolled exterior. The spaceport's threshold conditions are designed to support the specific operational needs of its functions while also acknowledging the symbolic weight of those thresholds. Crossing from the outside of the spaceport to the inside was always a meaningful act, not just a practical one. The architecture of the facility's transitions reflects that meaning. The post-collapse condition of the spaceport structure tells a story of buildings that were designed to endure. The facility is ruined, but not completely collapsed. The primary structural elements of the most robustly built areas are largely intact. The envelope systems have deteriorated significantly, but the bones of the buildings remain in forms that are still legible as the structures they were designed to be. This reflects both the quality of the original construction and the relative gentleness of the deterioration process compared to explosive destruction. The spaceport was abandoned rather than destroyed. An abandonment is a slower and in some ways more archaeologically legible fate than destruction. The Ark modifications to the spaceport structure are visible in certain areas of the map, overlaid on the original architecture in ways that tell a story of an occupant with different priorities and different material practices. Where the original construction used human industrial materials and technologies, Ark elements are distinctive in their character, materials and forms that reflect the technological tradition of the entities that produced them. The interface between human construction and Ark modification is one of the most interesting spatial experiences in the spaceport map, a place where you can read the encounter between two different intelligences, two different relationships to the built environment. The spaceport's orientation and arrangement on its site reflects the fundamental spatial logic of a launch facility, organized around the launch vectors that define the mission. The launch pads are the primary fixed points around which everything else is arranged. Other facilities are positioned in relation to them, at distances and orientations determined by safety requirements, operational logic, and the need to maintain clear access and visual communication with the launch systems. This launch-centric spatial logic gives the spaceport a clarity of organization that is different from most other types of complex facility, where the organizing logic is less explicitly directional. The spaceport always points toward the sky, and everything in its spatial organization reflects that pointing. The sense of scale that you get inside the spaceport's largest interior spaces is one of the more memorable sensory experiences the map creates. Volumes that were designed to contain spacecraft are simply enormous by human standards, dwarfing the player's body in ways that produce a visceral sense of the magnitude of what was done here. This sense of scale is not just an aesthetic effect, it is communicating something real about the ambitions of the people who built this facility and the magnitude of the undertaking they were part of. Walking through these spaces, you feel the weight of what the spaceport represented, the enormity of the project that it housed, in a way that description alone cannot fully convey. The spaceport, as a piece of architecture, is ultimately a monument to a particular kind of human capability, The ability to build at civilizational scale in response to a civilizational threat, to turn engineering and will into a physical instrument of survival. The facility's architecture does not celebrate this capability uncritically. The complexity of the choices made in its design, the evidence of competing priorities and imperfect compromises, the traces of the human cost of its construction, all of these are part of the architectural record. The Spaceport is a great building in the sense that it achieved something that most buildings never attempt. But it is also a building that carries the full weight of its history, including the parts of that history that are not easy to celebrate. Chapter 4. The Shuttles, Vessels of Hope and Desperation. The Exodus shuttles were the culminating achievement of the entire Spaceport project. Everything that was built, every decision that was made, every life that was disrupted or ended in the construction and operation of the facility was ultimately in service of these vehicles. They were not beautiful in the conventional aerospace sense. They were large, utilitarian, designed to carry maximum payload with maximum reliability rather than to express any particular aesthetic ambition. But they were impressive in the way that a thing built to perform at the limits of what is technically possible is always impressive, in the visible evidence of effort and ingenuity concentrated toward a single purpose. Looking at the remains of shuttle-related infrastructure in the Spaceport today, you can still sense something of the vehicles that once occupied those spaces, the scale of them, the technical complexity, the sheer physical presence of something built to leave the planet. The design philosophy behind the Exodus shuttles was shaped by a fundamental tension between ambition and pragmatism. The ideal shuttle, from a pure engineering perspective, would have been larger, more capable, more thoroughly tested, and built to tighter tolerances than time and resources permitted. The actual shuttle was a compromise between the ideal and the possible, optimized for the characteristics that mattered most under the specific constraints of the program. Carrying capacity was prioritized above almost everything else, because every additional passenger represented a life saved. Reliability was prioritized above performance, because a shuttle that failed to complete its mission was worse than one that was merely slower or less comfortable. The resulting vehicles were not elegant, but they were capable, and capability was what the moment required. The interior layout of the Exodus shuttles is suggested by certain details in the Spaceport's environment, in the scale of the processing facilities, the width of the access corridors designed to move groups of passengers, and the dimensions of the loading systems. The passenger areas of the shuttles appear to have been arranged for density rather than comfort, with accommodation configurations that were designed to carry maximum numbers, rather than to provide the kind of personal space that long-duration space travel ideally requires. The trade-offs embedded in those accommodation decisions were understood and accepted by the program's planners, but they were also decisions that imposed significant physical and psychological costs on the people who experienced them. The passenger experience of the Exodus shuttles was almost certainly difficult in ways that the official record preferred not to document. The life support systems aboard the shuttles were among the most technically sophisticated components of the entire vehicle. Everything else could be compromised in the name of weight reduction and cost control, but the life support systems could not be allowed to fail. The design of these systems drew on the full depth of human space travel experience and pushed considerably beyond it, because the Exodus missions were not hours or days, but potentially months or years in duration. Closed-loop systems for air recycling, water recovery, and waste management had to work reliably, without external servicing, for the entire duration of the mission. The engineers who designed these systems were working at the frontier of what was achievable, and the evidence suggests that they largely succeeded, though at a cost in a system complexity that created its own maintenance challenges. Propulsion systems for the Exodus shuttles were engineered to balance performance against reliability and fuel efficiency. A shuttle carrying hundreds of people on a multi-year journey needs propulsion that is powerful enough to achieve the necessary trajectories, efficient enough to make that journey on the fuel it can carry, and reliable enough to keep functioning without maintenance for the entire duration. These requirements pointed toward propulsion architectures that were somewhat more conservative than the most advanced systems of the time, trading peak performance for operational robustness. The engines that emerged from this design philosophy were not the most powerful that the pre-collapse aerospace industry could have produced, but they were among the most reliable, and reliability was what the mission demanded. The navigation and guidance systems of the Exodus shuttles represent a particular area of technical achievement. Once a shuttle left Earth's atmosphere, it was essentially on its own, navigating by autonomous systems without the possibility of real-time correction from ground control. The navigation computers carried aboard the shuttles were the most capable autonomous space navigation systems that had ever been built, incorporating stellar positioning, inertial guidance, and orbital mechanics calculations of extraordinary precision. The law suggests that these systems performed well in operation, that the shuttles reached their intended trajectories with acceptable accuracy, which is significant given the complexity of what was being attempted. Radiation protection was one of the more difficult technical challenges of the Exodus shuttle design. Long-duration space travel exposes occupants to levels of radiation that are significantly higher than anything experienced on Earth's surface, and the cumulative dose over a multi-year journey could have severe health consequences without adequate shielding. The radiation protection systems incorporated into the shuttle design were the best available, but they also represented a significant mass budget, competing with the weight allotted to passengers and cargo. The trade-offs made in the radiation protection design were calculated compromises between acceptable radiation exposure and carrying capacity, and the evidence suggests that these trade-offs were accepted knowingly, with full awareness of the long-term health implications. The communication systems aboard the Exodus shuttles were designed to maintain contact with Earth and with any orbital infrastructure for as long as technically feasible. Long-range communication in space is a technically demanding proposition, requiring powerful transmitters, highly directional antennas, and communication protocols designed to work across increasing distances with increasing signal delays. The communication systems of the shuttles were designed with the expectation that contact would eventually become impractical as distance increased, but the aspiration was to maintain some form of communication for as long as possible. The degree to which this aspiration was realized is one of the open questions in the law. Personal space aboard the Exodus shuttles was minimal by any reasonable standard. The accommodation design prioritized numbers over comfort in ways that were clearly understood to have psychological consequences, but were accepted as necessary. People were living in conditions of extreme density, with limited privacy, limited personal space, and limited ability to vary their immediate environment. The psychological management of a population living under these conditions for an extended period was one of the most significant non-technical challenges of the shuttle missions, and the preparations made for it, in the selection of crew, the design of social spaces, and the programming of activities and routines, reflected a serious engagement with the challenge, even if the solutions were necessarily imperfect. The cargo carried by the Exodus shuttles beyond the human passengers themselves was selected through a process that was simultaneously scientific, political, and intensely personal. The official cargo included carefully curated collections of seeds, genetic material, digital archives of human knowledge, technical equipment for civilizational reconstruction, medical supplies, and the materials needed to establish basic survival infrastructure at the destination. The unofficial cargo, the things that people managed to bring through various means despite weight limitations, represented the full range of human attachment to the material world: family photos, musical instruments, books, objects of sentimental value that had no practical application, but that people could not bring themselves to leave behind. The mixture of the official and unofficial cargo tells a complete story of what humans are and what they value when everything is at stake. Testing of the Exodus shuttles was compressed but not eliminated. The program conducted a series of unmanned test flights and partial mission rehearsals before committing passengers to the vehicles. But the compressed timeline meant that the testing was less extensive than the engineers would have preferred. The test program revealed and addressed a number of issues, but the awareness that some undetected issues remained was a persistent source of concern for the technical teams. The decision to proceed with launches despite this awareness was not reckless. It was a rational response to a situation in which waiting for a more complete test program was not compatible with the urgency of the threat, but it was also a decision made with full knowledge that it carried risk. The maintenance philosophy for the Exodus shuttles was shaped by the reality that once they left Earth, there would be no external maintenance support. Everything that needed to happen to keep the vehicles functional for their entire mission duration had to happen from the resources carried aboard. This drove a design approach that emphasized robustness and repairability, that preferred simple, repairable systems over complex, high-performance ones, and that built significant spare capacity and redundancy into everything critical. The maintenance culture that the shuttle crews developed during the missions, the approaches to managing systems that were aging and sometimes failing under conditions that ground teams had not fully anticipated, would have been one of the most important bodies of practical knowledge generated by the Exodus program. The psychological design of the shuttle interior, the deliberate choices about color, proportion, spatial sequence, and the provision of meaningful variation in the lived environment was an aspect of the program that received serious attention. The people running the Exodus program had access to research on the psychological effects of long-duration spaceflight and isolation, and they used that research to inform the design of the spaces where passengers and crew would spend years of their lives. The results were not perfect, but they were thoughtful, reflecting an awareness that maintaining the psychological health of the shuttle population was as important as maintaining the technical health of the vehicle. The cultural life that developed aboard the Exodus shuttles during the missions was something that the program planners prepared for, but could not entirely anticipate. People in extreme and unprecedented conditions develop cultural responses that are unique to their situation, and the shuttle communities were no exception. The social structures, the norms, the rituals, the art, the humour, the conflicts, and the solidarities that emerged aboard the shuttles were products of a specific human experience that had never existed before. The lore hints at this developing culture without documenting it in detail, but the suggestion is there that the shuttle communities became genuinely distinctive human societies, shaped by their unique circumstances in ways that distinguished them from the Earth they had left. The launch sequence for an Exodus shuttle was one of the most technically complex and emotionally charged events in the spaceport's history. Weeks of preparation culminated in a final countdown that involved the coordinated action of hundreds of people across the entire facility. The technical protocols of the launch were exacting and inflexible because a mistake at this stage had potentially catastrophic consequences. But the human reality of the moment, the finality of what was happening, the weight of all the preparation and sacrifice that had led to this point, gave the technical event a dimension that no protocol could fully contain. The lore suggests that launch days at the spaceport were among the most intensely experienced moments in the facility's history, for everyone present, regardless of their role. The first moments after launch, as the shuttle cleared the gantry and began its ascent, were the most dangerous phase of the entire mission. The concentration of energy required to lift a fully loaded shuttle off the ground, the structural loads on the vehicle, the acoustic and thermal environment of the launch, all of these created conditions in which a single failure could be catastrophic. The probability of such a failure had been reduced by the testing program and the engineering conservatism of the design, but it could not be eliminated. For the people watching from the spaceport's observation points and control facilities, the minutes between launch ignition and successful orbit insertion were the longest of their lives. For the people aboard the shuttle, they were the most extreme physical experience most of them had ever had. Ascent trajectory planning for the Exodus shuttles was a complex optimization problem that balanced multiple competing objectives. The trajectory had to be efficient enough to achieve the required orbital parameters within the available fuel budget. It had to be designed to minimize the peak loads on the vehicle structure and the peak accelerations experienced by passengers. It had to be planned with awareness of the potential arc activity in the launch corridor, and it had to be flexible enough to accommodate deviations from the nominal plan if technical or environmental conditions required. The trajectory planners were some of the most technically skilled people in the spaceport's workforce, and their work was one of the more direct determinants of mission success or failure. The moment of reaching orbit was the first of several critical milestones in an Exodus shuttle mission. Achieving orbit meant that the vehicle had survived the most dangerous phase of the mission and was now in a stable configuration from which further mission steps could proceed. But it was also a moment of no return. Once in orbit, the shuttle was no longer on Earth in any practical sense. The people aboard had left. Whatever happened from that point, whatever challenges the mission brought, whatever the destination turned out to be, they were not coming back to stand on Earth's surface again. The emotional weight of orbital insertion, for those aboard who allowed themselves to feel it, must have been extraordinary. The engineering lineage of the Exodus shuttles, the technologies and design decisions that trace their ancestry to earlier human spaceflight, is visible in the architecture of the vehicles and the infrastructure that supported them. The spaceport is part of a continuum of human ambition that runs from the earliest rockets through the first human orbital flights and the era of space stations, all the way to these enormous vessels built for one-way journeys to an uncertain destination. The Exodus shuttles represent the furthest extension of this lineage, the most ambitious application of the technologies and knowledge accumulated over that entire history. That history is present in the spaceport's environment, encoded in the design choices of the infrastructure and the vehicles it was built to serve. The sound of an Exodus shuttle launch was one of the defining sonic experiences of the pre-collapse era for anyone who witnessed it. The acoustic energy of a full-scale launch was extraordinary, the kind of physical experience that people described as much with their bodies as with their words. Communities across the region around the spaceport experienced these launches as events that were simultaneously awe-inspiring and deeply unsettling, expressions of both human capability and human desperation. After the launches ended, the silence that replaced them in the spaceport's operational environment was described by those who experienced it as a different kind of profound, a silence that carried within it all the weight of what had departed. The biological systems aboard the Exodus shuttles, the systems for growing food, recycling nutrients, and maintaining the biological support infrastructure for a long-duration mission, were another area where the program pushed the limits of what was technically achievable. Closed-loop biological systems of the kind required for a genuine, long-duration mission had been studied for decades but had never been operated at the scale the Exodus missions required. The challenge was not just technical, but biological, requiring an understanding of how ecosystems function in microgravity and how they can be managed without the natural regulatory mechanisms that Earth-based systems rely on. The solutions developed for the Exodus missions were innovative and, the lore suggests, largely successful, though the management of these systems throughout the mission duration was one of the more demanding, ongoing technical responsibilities of the shuttle crews. The information systems aboard the Exodus shuttles were among the most sophisticated computing and data management systems of the pre-collapse era. The amount of data required to manage a shuttle mission, from navigation to life support to medical monitoring to the vast knowledge archive carried in the digital cargo, demanded computing capacity that was at the leading edge of what was achievable. The information infrastructure of the shuttle was also its connection to the knowledge of human civilization, the repository of everything that humanity had decided was worth preserving. The people aboard were, in a sense, living alongside the largest library in human history, and the relationship between the shuttle communities and that archive would have been one of the more interesting cultural dimensions of the mission. The weapons carried aboard Exodus shuttles are not something the lore addresses directly, but it is a question that the environment invites. A vessel carrying a significant portion of humanity's surviving population through uncertain space, potentially encountering unknown conditions or other survivors from Earth, would have needed some capacity for self-defense. The evidence in the spaceport's physical environment and the security culture of the overall program suggests that this question was addressed, even if the details are not documented. The nature and extent of any defensive capability aboard the shuttles is one of the more speculative aspects of the program's technical history. The relationship between the different shuttles in the Exodus fleet, the degree to which they were in communication with each other and coordinating their activities, is another of the program's open questions. If multiple shuttles launched at different times toward the same destination, at what point did they become a fleet, a community of vessels with shared purpose and communication? The lore hints at the existence of some planned coordination between shuttles without fully describing it. The degree to which the original coordination plan survived the realities of the launches and the conditions encountered in space is unknown. The arrival of Exodus shuttles at their intended destinations, if they arrived successfully, would have been one of the most significant moments in the history of the human species. The first moments of a human community establishing itself in a new location, whether orbital, planetary, or something else entirely, represent a kind of beginning that carries enormous weight. The lore does not give us those arrival scenes. It does not tell us where the shuttles went or what they found when they got there. That silence is one of the most powerful aspects of the game's narrative structure, the absence of a happy ending, or even a known ending, for the Exodus mission. The social dynamics aboard the Exodus shuttles during the missions would have been shaped by the extreme conditions of the journey in ways that are interesting to think about. A closed community under stress develops particular social structures, particular hierarchies and coalitions, particular ways of managing conflict and maintaining cohesion. The shuttle communities were extreme versions of this phenomenon, populations that could not leave, that were entirely dependent on each other and on the vehicle systems, that had to find ways to live together under conditions of physical and psychological intensity that had no precedent. The social history of the Exodus missions, if it were ever recoverable, would be one of the most extraordinary documents of human adaptation ever produced. The children born aboard Exodus shuttles during the missions represent one of the more fascinating aspects of the program's legacy. People in long-duration space travel are people, and people in communities eventually produce children. Children born aboard the shuttles would have had no experiential memory of Earth. Their entire world would have been the shuttle, its systems, its people, its rhythms. The first generation of humans with no direct experience of Earth, born in the void on their way to somewhere unknown, are a kind of people that had never existed before. Whatever they eventually became, wherever they ended up, they were the first truly post-Earth humans, and the spaceport is the place from which their parents departed. The physical legacy of the Exodus shuttle program in the spaceport's environment is significant. The launch infrastructure, the processing facilities, the fuel systems, the maintenance spaces, all of these were built specifically to support the shuttles and now stand as records of their existence. But the most direct physical evidence of the shuttles themselves, the vehicles, is absent. The shuttles that launched successfully are gone, departed beyond recovery. Those that may have failed before leaving the atmosphere are represented only by damage patterns and debris evidence that the environment of the spaceport still contains in fragmentary form. The absence of the shuttles is itself one of the most powerful features of the spaceport as a law environment. The spaces built around them are enormous. The vehicles themselves are gone. What fills those spaces now is memory and arc. The fate of shuttle missions that encountered mechanical failure during launch or ascent is one of the more difficult aspects of the Exodus program's history to contemplate. The program did not have a perfect safety record. The evidence suggests that some missions did not survive their launches, that the combination of a compressed testing program, the edge of capability engineering, and the hostile conditions of arc-influenced pre-collapse Earth produced at least some catastrophic failures. These failures were managed in a particular way by the program's communication strategy, acknowledged minimally, not dwelt upon, framed as the tragic but acceptable cost of attempting something so difficult under such difficult conditions. The people who died in those failures are among the least commemorated casualties of the Exodus program, their deaths absorbed into the official narrative as data points in an acceptable failure rate. The relationship between the Exodus shuttles and the Ark entities that were the cause of the entire evacuation is one of the most strategically significant questions the law raises. Did Ark attempt to intercept or destroy the shuttles? Did it track their trajectories? Did it understand what they were and what they carried? The law is deliberately ambiguous on these questions, suggesting awareness of the launches on Ark's part without specifying the nature of that awareness or the response it produced. The degree to which the Exodus missions succeeded in departing without Ark interference, or the degree to which they did not, is a dimension of the story that the game leaves for players to speculate about based on the available evidence. The specific missions that the Exodus shuttles were executing point toward a layered strategy rather than a single destination. Different missions may have had different objectives, different destinations, different compositions of passengers and cargo designed to optimize the probability that at least some of the missions would succeed in establishing a viable human presence somewhere beyond Earth. This hedging strategy, if that is what it was, reflects a sophistication in the Exodus program's planning that goes beyond simple evacuation. It suggests planners who understood that the probability of any single mission succeeding was uncertain, and who designed the overall program to be robust to individual mission failures. The weight of what was carried by every Exodus shuttle, not just the physical weight of passengers and cargo, but the weight of what they represented, the hopes and memories and knowledge and genetic heritage of an entire civilization, is almost impossible to fully comprehend. Each person aboard those vehicles was the bearer of a specific human history, a specific set of relationships and experiences and knowledge that existed nowhere else in the universe. The aggregate of those specific histories was humanity, everything that distinguished the human species from any other configuration of matter. The Exodus shuttles were not just vehicles, they were the most important cargo containers in the history of the species. The silence that follows a successful launch, the moment when the noise and fury of departure gives way to the quiet of absence, is one of the defining experiential features of a launch site's life. The spaceport experienced this silence repeatedly. As each shuttle departed and left the facility, to adjust to the new fact of its departure. Each successive silence was deeper than the last, as the number of remaining shuttles and remaining passengers decreased and the facility moved closer to the end of its mission. The final silence after the last launch was different in kind from all the previous ones. It was not the silence before the next departure. It was the silence after the last one. And it is that silence, deepened now by years of abandonment and ark occupation, that you are moving through when you enter the spaceport today. The ongoing mystery of where the Exodus shuttles went and what happened to them is one of the most compelling open threads in the entire lore of Ark Raiders. If they arrived safely, if the people aboard survived and established communities somewhere beyond Earth, then the story of the spaceport is not just a story of loss, it is a story of beginning, of human life continuing somewhere beyond the horizon of what we can currently see. The possibility that somewhere out there, the descendants of the people who passed through the spaceport's departure halls are still alive, still remembering Earth, still carrying the cultural inheritance that was loaded onto those shuttles, is one of the most resonant aspects of the game's larger narrative. The spaceport is simultaneously a monument to departure and a question about arrival. The Exodus shuttles are gone, but the space they occupied in the spaceport's history is enormous. Every major facility in the complex, every major decision that was made, every major sacrifice that was asked and given was in service of getting those vehicles off the ground. The fact that they succeeded in launching whatever happened to them after that is a genuine achievement, one that the spaceport's ruins silently testify to. The gantries stand empty, the processing halls are quiet, the launch pads bear only the scorched marks of the fires that once burned at their bases, and somewhere, impossibly far away, the products of all that effort are either still travelling or they have arrived. Either way, the spaceport made it possible, and the spaceport still carries that fact in its bones. Chapter 5. The people of the spaceport, workers, soldiers, and those who waited. The people of the spaceport were as varied as the world that produced them, a cross-section of humanity drawn together by the particular demands of the most consequential project in human history. They were engineers and administrators, security personnel and cooks, scientists and cleaners, medical staff and logistics specialists. They were people selected for specific skills, people who ended up there through connections or luck, people who had been assigned without meaningful choice, and people who had fought their way into a role because they understood the stakes and needed to be part of the response. What united them was the shared experience of living and working in a place that was simultaneously the most important location on Earth and one of the most difficult places to be human. The engineering workforce of the spaceport was its most visible and celebrated population. These were the people whose work was directly connected to the mission, whose expertise was the reason the facility existed. They worked on the shuttles themselves, on the launch infrastructure, on the life support systems, on the fuel handling, on the communication arrays. Their technical skill was extraordinary by any measure, the product of advanced education and concentrated experience in the most demanding aerospace environment of the era. The culture of the engineering workforce was shaped by the combination of technical excellence and extreme urgency that characterized the program, a culture that was competitive and demanding, but also, in most accounts, deeply committed to the shared mission. The administrative staff of the spaceport were the people who kept the facility functioning as an organization rather than just a collection of technical systems. Logistics, procurement, personnel management, record keeping, communications, coordination with the external authorities that governed the program, all of these functions required dedicated professional staff whose contribution was less visible than the engineers but no less essential. The administrative workers of the spaceport developed their own culture, shaped by the particular stresses of managing a complex organization in emergency conditions, a culture that valued efficiency and discretion, and that was often privy to information that the general workforce was not. The security personnel of the spaceport occupied a unique and often uncomfortable position in the facility's social ecosystem. Their job was to protect the facility and its mission, but the definition of what that protection required expanded steadily over the operational period as external threats multiplied and internal social tensions grew. Security personnel were the institutional face of the program's most difficult decisions, the people who enforced the access controls, who managed the perimeter against the communities outside, who dealt with the social disruptions that were an inevitable product of the facility situation. The relationship between the security staff and the rest of the spaceport's population was complex, characterized by a mix of respect for their necessary function and discomfort with the realities of what that function sometimes required. The medical staff of the spaceport provided care that went well beyond what a typical industrial medical facility would offer. They were treating the full spectrum of health needs of a large stressed population, from occupational injuries to the chronic diseases of aging workers to the acute psychological crises that the facility's conditions produced. They were also responsible for the pre-departure health assessments of evacuees, a function that gave them unusual power in the selection process and that created ethical tensions that the most thoughtful among them felt deeply. The medical staff of the spaceport were among its most humanly engaged workers, because medicine forces a kind of direct encounter with the human reality of a situation that other professional roles can sometimes distance themselves from. The maintenance workers who kept the spaceport's physical infrastructure functioning were among the least glamorous, but most essential, of the facility's workforce. Maintaining a launch facility is an enormous and continuous undertaking, requiring constant attention to the systems that support all other functions. Pipework and electrical systems, HVAC and structural elements, mechanical systems of enormous complexity, all of these required constant skilled attention to remain operational. The maintenance workers of the spaceport were practical people, problem solvers, people who understood the facility's physical reality at a detailed and intimate level that the more theoretically trained professionals often lacked. Their knowledge of the facility's quirks and vulnerabilities was a form of institutional knowledge that was difficult to document and impossible to replace if lost. The cooks and food service staff of the spaceport provided one of the facility's most socially important functions. Meals were one of the few regular experiences that brought the different communities of the spaceport's population together in a shared social space, and the quality and character of the food service had a significant impact on the facility's social atmosphere. The food service staff occupied an interesting social position, interacting with virtually every other group in the facility, but belonging fully to none of them, developing their own community centered on the practical realities of feeding thousands of people under difficult logistical conditions. Their knowledge of the facility's social dynamics, gleaned from countless interactions in a neutral space, made them among the better informed members of the population about what was actually going on across the facility. The scientists engaged in research at the spaceport, both the aerospace engineers who were advancing the shuttle technology and the researchers studying Ark and its behavior, formed a community with distinctive characteristics. They were among the most highly educated people in the facility, accustomed to the culture of evidence and argument that characterizes scientific work,